All right, Scott. Oops. Scott.
Good afternoon, Commissioner President Doobie, Commissioners, Director Nesbitt. It appears the rest of the afternoon we'll go over our proposed draft 2000 or draft CWD management plan. But before we do that, for a little background information on CWD in Wyoming, I'm going to ask Hank Edwards to come forward and provide a 2019 CWD surveillance presentation, again, as some background before we get into the plan. Hank?
President Doobie, members of the commission, Director Nesbitt, thanks for giving me the chance to come here and talk to you today about chronic wasting disease. Seems like I do this every year. I have a nice short presentation. It's only about 15 slides. I'm going to talk about, of course, what we found in this year's surveillance, as well as some of the changes we've made with our surveillance program, and then finally where we're headed in this year in 2020, as well as 2021. So quickly, just a quick brief update, or not update, but background on CWD, although I'm sure you don't need it. Remember that CWD is a fatal disease affecting the nervous system of deer, elk, moose, rainbow caribou. To date, there's been no documented immunity, recovery, or absolute resistance to this disease, although we do know that different genetic profiles can influence how long the incubation period is. Nonetheless, animals once infected generally die in about 2.5 years. We know that this disease is transmitted both directly, as an animal to animal, as well as indirectly through the environment. So when animals come in contact with prions that have been shed by other infected servants. This disease was first documented in Wyoming in 1985 in a mule deer in the southeastern corner of the state. Since that time, we've done a pretty extensive monitoring program for surveillance. And over the last 23 years, we've looked at almost 66,000 samples. This disease now occurs in 32 of our 37 mule deer herds and 9 of our 36 elk herds. So obviously, this disease is not as widespread in our elk herds as it is in our mule deer herds. As I mentioned, we did a big shift in our surveillance program, and that was a shift from detection to monitoring. So obviously, since this disease now covers 3/4 of the state, it was necessary to continue to monitor those populations that are infected with the disease, as well as continuing to monitor where this disease exists and where it does not. So to do that, we set up a 5-year rotational surveillance program, and basically it means that each region will concentrate on only 1 or 2 herd units in each of their regions. The goal is to sample at least 200 samples from each of those herd units and hopefully collect them between 1 and 3 years. The focus is on adult bucks, and that mostly means mule deer, but in some regions that also means white-tailed deer as well. And we also focus on adult elk, both males and females. The goal here obviously is to get statistically significant sample sizes so that once every 5 years we have a really good handle on just what the prevalence is in each of our herd units. As I mentioned, we'll continue doing annual surveillance in all of our negative hunt areas, again, to document the distribution of this disease. And then finally, free statewide testing that will continue, and hunters can get their animal tested at each regional office at no charge. The final thing we did was increase the laboratory capacity, where we jumped from 8,000 samples to 15,000 samples. We did that with your help by providing funds so we could buy additional laboratory equipment. And we also spilled over into the forensics laboratory at the Laramie Regional Office. So this is a list of priority mule deer and elk herd units that were attacked in 2019. I won't go through each one of those here, because I'll talk about them later in my presentation. But basically, you can see that each region had between 1 and 2 herd units that they concentrated it on, whether it be deer or elk. So as far as results go, once all the dust settled from all the surveillance activities of the year, we tested just over 5,000 samples. The vast majority of those were mule deer, which is typical. So 2,281 mule deer. We looked at 1,200 white-tailed deer, 1,400 elk, and 77 moose. CWD was identified in 3 new hunt areas this year. We identified it in Hunt Area 50, which is on the ridge of the Bighorns. We also identified it in Hunt Area 105, which is near Clark. We actually found 7 animals there. There were 6 hunter killed and 1 roadkill. And then finally, we identified it in Hunt Area 152, which is near the Hoback, where we found 2 positive mule deer bucks there. So this is just a table of all the samples we received, and this is all samples. So this is all sexes, all ages. I'll get down into the statistics for just mule deer bucks here shortly, but this just gives you an idea of the distribution of samples. I'm not going to go through each one. Just be aware that we obviously look at a fair number of targeted animals, and those are animals that are showing signs of the disease, as well as roadkill animals. As far as hunter killed, we looked at 1,900 mule deer with 262 positives, 1,200 white-tailed deer with 193 positives, 1,200 elk with 20 positives, 47 hunter-killed moose, 4 positives, for a grand total of 4,447 with 475 positives. When you total it all up, out of the 5,000 samples, we looked at just over, or we looked at 570 positives. There's a map showing the distribution of our sampling across the state. You can see we've got a pretty good distribution, with most of our sampling coming from those targeted areas. As you can also see, we have a pretty good distribution within our target areas. That's something we're looking at to make sure that we're getting a good representation from each of those herd units. And of course, this is what it looks like in elk. You can see the Snowy Range down there. They got a very good sample size this year, as well as the Afton and Pinedale herd unit. So diving now just into mule deer bucks, I'm going to go through each of those target herd units. The first was the Clark's Fork. Like I mentioned, we had 6 animals that were from there and 1 roadkill. 4 of those animals were mule deer, so that gave us a prevalence of 11%. North Natrona and Powder River. North Natrona is an area we have a difficult time getting samples from, but we're sitting at about 5% there with 58 samples. Powder River, they did a really good job getting samples from there. We had almost 300 with 33 positives, so our prevalence there is 11%. We last sampled that area in 2010 or 2011, and at that time the prevalence was 1.4%. So it's increased quite a bit since that initial sampling in 2010. The project was a big surprise for us. We got 77 samples, and over half of those were positive for CWD, sitting at a 57% prevalence rate. That was a shocker. Rattlesnake and Sheep Mountain, again, those are areas that are difficult to get samples on, but we're looking at 12 and 13% respectively. Shoshone River, this is another area we haven't hit in quite a while, and we got 106 samples for an overall prevalence of 25%.
Hank, pardon my, where's the project? Where's that at?
The project sits right around the Wind River Indian Reservation, around Pavilion.
Thank you.
And then Uinta, which is probably the one shining part, still no CWD identified in that area. So we have 70 samples. So the regions will go back and try and beef up the sample sizes on all these to get to our 200. So they'll continue to work on that in the coming years. So as I go forward, I'm going to move now and break down these statistics even more. So I'm going to look at the project, I'm going to look at Shoshone River, and I'll look at Powder River. So So these statistics now are broken into adults, but male and female mule deer as opposed to male and female white-tailed deer. And you'll see there's quite a difference between these three areas. So this is a compilation of all the samples we've received over the last 5 years. So from each of these areas. So looking at Powder River, good sample size of 331, we're sitting at 11% prevalence. As opposed to females, we only have 51 samples, but prevalence is much lower at 4%. Male white-tailed deer, you can see it's pretty high prevalence of 36% with 91 samples, whereas females are sitting about 21% with 58 samples. The project, again, 95 samples, 56% of which are positive, as opposed to females, which are down around 14% with 64 samples. Suppose that to white-tailed deer, 20%, and female white-tailed deer at 12. Shoshone River, you'll see that both the mule deer and the white-tailed deer are very similar there, whereas 23% for males and 8% for female mule deer, as opposed to 19% and 9% for whitetail. So very, very similar there. So you can see that each of our hunt areas responds a little bit differently to this disease. Sometimes we see a higher prevalence in white-tailed deer, and sometimes we don't. Moving on to the target elk herd units, you can see Afton and Pinedale. Yeah, again, they weren't able to get a large sample size, but we did identify CWD in those areas. And then finally, the Snowy Range, where they were able to get a great sample of 224, 3 positives for a prevalence of 1%. So just a few words before I leave the 2019 surveillance. You know, we geared up for what we thought was going to be a bang-up surveillance year. With our new surveillance strategy and the demand for the public, we thought we'd really be looking at about 8,000 samples. Obviously, that didn't happen. I think a lot of that, why it was lower than we expected, was probably because we did have a new surveillance strategy, and I'm not sure hunters were up to speed with that yet. So going forward, I think that's one of the things we need to work on as far as educating the public, not only about this new surveillance strategy, but also educating them as to why it's important that they allow us to sample their deer or seek us out to sample their deer. Because it's maybe not, if they're not concerned about it from a human health standpoint, maybe they should be concerned about it from an animal health standpoint. And then finally, there's certainly some areas that we're just going to have a hard time getting samples from, right? Either the sunning season is stretched out for several weeks, making it difficult to get enough personnel in there, or it's very remote. And I'm sure that in the future, some of these areas we're going to have to consider mandatory sampling to collect a significant sample size. So moving on to 2020, 2021, this is for mule deer. 2020 is listed in kind of that purple. So that would be Grable River, Sweetwater, Pumpkin Buttes, Cheyenne River. And you can see from the blue, those are where we're headed in 2021. So the North Bighorn, Paint Rock, Black Hills, etc. And then finally, for our elk units, you can see we're going to target Cody, Ball Creek, Upper Green River, and West Green River in 2020. And then 2021, we'll hit the Sierra Madres, North Bighorn, Medicine Lodge, and the Piney Elk Group. That's all I've got on surveillance. It's a pretty quick and dirty presentation. Is there any questions I can answer, Commissioner?
I've got Michael. Excuse me. Mike, go ahead, Jalen.
I was curious on your sampling, where you'd like to get 200. Are you going to try to target more females so that maybe you'd have the data from 100 mule deer bucks and 100 mule deer does to compare? Or are you just interested in samples of whatever you can get?
President Duty, Commissioner Bird, that's a good question. We need 200 samples from adult males, whether that be mule deer or white-tailed deer, because that gives us a good statistical base for us to determine our prevalence. That's not to say we don't want samples from females, because we certainly do. So we're pushing those as well, but our main goal is to get those samples from the males. Does that
It
make
does
sense?
appear that it's higher in males, then I wonder if that has more testing.
Well, we certainly do have, you could see from that chart, we certainly do have some data from females, and we continue to monitor females through roadkills. So we know that's biased a little bit. It still gives us some data from some of those herd units. So by no means are we walking away from samples from does.
Hank, I've got a couple of questions. One, looking back on your slide presentation on mine, slide number 8, and I'm happy to see all these dots. But I got to looking at this thing. Has there been any work done or any work proposed? I mean, it looks to me like when I see all these red dots on this slide, the vast majority of them are out in the lower country, drier country. Like I said, is there any work being done on maybe feed issue, feed quality, water quality out in those areas? Does that have any effect on CWD? It seems to me that all the ones that are tested hot in higher elevations are all negative, or a good majority of them, vast majority of them. The vast majority of the positives are out in the drier, lowland country, it seems like, under the slide here. So I was just curious if anybody's looked at that or thought of looking at that, if might be any correlation there with CWD and food quality and water quality.
President Duby, Commissioner Schmidt, you know, we do look at that, and unfortunately, you really need a map of all those positives over time. I think I've showed you that, haven't I, where we have all the heat map of all the positives for the last 10 years or 15 years. I do have a copy of that. Okay. I can certainly dig that up. But you lose some of that differentiation that you're seeing there, and those positives are pretty widespread across the state. Hopefully getting to your question about food quality, we certainly see with our research animals that quality of feed doesn't seem to affect the disease. It still progresses as the same rate that we see in the wild. So food quality doesn't seem to make a big difference on how long the incubation period is.
Anything on water?
As far as water goes, there's been some look at that, particularly looking at trace minerals. Is that where you're going with this? Mm-hmm. And there certainly has been some look into that. One paper that I'm familiar with, I think they found a little more manganese in the water, or magnesium, excuse me. And but that to date hasn't been linked to whether it's preventing the disease or lengthening the incubation period.
And then on the testing, we're talking about 200 tests per herd unit. We've got how many herd units? 37, I think, statewide. Have we met that goal in any of the herd units yet?
President Duby, Commissioner Schmidt, yes, we did meet it in the Snowy Range. They were above that. I think the Powder River was that last year. There's been several that we have met. There's many more that we have not met.
So there's probably 25 or 30 that haven't met that.
Yeah, it's a big goal to reach.
So my question is, where I'm going with that, I mean, CWD is a hot button issue right now. What? We've got capacity to handle 15,000 tests a year. Why wouldn't we try to get all of those tests done in a shorter period of time? Than 3 years, I think is what you're proposing.
3 years, because that seems to be what we can handle in the field with our field personnel. Because it takes a lot of work, a lot of time to collect those samples. So this is what we can seem to handle pretty well as far as sample sizes go.
Okay.
My question for Hank would be, do we have a per sample cost for the cost of the department? We roughly know what it costs to run a sample?
We do. President Duty, Commissioner Brokaw, sorry. So yes, it's $32 for us to run the sample. The test itself runs us about $10. The rest is all in disposables and technician time, AWAC technician time.
Thank you.
Any other questions at this time? Don't go far.
Okay, well, a couple things if I can, while I have the floor. One of the things that we've done differently this year too is we're utilizing the prison here in Rollins and inmates to assemble our CWD and brucellosis kits. That actually has been a tremendous time saving because we assemble about 20,000 kits in total between those two diseases that we surveyed for. And the prison has been really nice to work with, and we look forward to working with them in the future. And it's certainly freed up a lot of our time. And second of all, as more on a personal note, as somebody who has stood up here in front of you or the commissions before you and talked about CWD from 20 years ago when it was just kind of an obscure disease, to now when we have enough information to know that this disease is not so obscure, it can be a big threat to some of our populations. And from somebody who's really watched this disease move across the state, I got to say that I'm really in support of this plan. And Commissioner Crank was right on when he directed us, the department, to develop a way to manage this disease because it's time. And I think it's time that you don't have to listen to me talk about how high prevalence gets in a particular area. Start maybe try and do something about it because 57% prevalence is really high enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Hank.
Thank you, Hank. And so moving on into the plan, we'll kind of break this into 3 sections. I want to provide a little more background on the plan, and then I'm going to ask Dr. Jessica Western to talk about the big collaborative process we did, and then Kristen Gunther and Josh Corsi, who are the co-chairs of the working group, talk about that real quick, and then we're going to get into the actual plan. So about the next 20 minutes, we're just going to give a little more background information because we feel that's important. So why are we here today? Several reasons. One, it was the Commission's desire a year or two ago for us to be more proactive in managing CWD, and we agree with that. CWD has increased in prevalence and distribution throughout Wyoming, as just shown by Hank. CWD has population impacts. As wildlife managers, we must explore ways to manage CWD for the long-term health and sustainability of our deer, elk, and moose populations. Doing nothing is an action that we have taken for many years, but is no longer acceptable. It's against our mission of conserving wildlife and serving people. And as wildlife management leaders, this is the right time for this plan to move forward. The plan is based in science. It's a solid plan and will pave a path forward for addressing CWD in Wyoming. As I said, it's based on science and not misinformation and emotion. And lastly, I'd like to thank the department steering committee members, Dr. Mary Wood, Justin Binfit, Brad Hovingay, Janet Millick, Hank Edwards, and at the very end, Dr. Samantha Allen, our new wildlife veterinarian, as well as the overall state CWD management team that included Corey Klass, Mark Kroger, Justin Dodd, Chris Baird, Lee Knox, Greg Anderson, and Jordan Kraft. All those people were key in working on this plan and presenting and putting together and then what's presented before you today. So with that, I'd like to ask Dr. Jessica Western to come forward and talk about the CWD working group collaborative process.
Okay, great, thank you. Good afternoon, members of the commission, President Doobie and Director Nesvik. Last time I was here, I made Scott negotiate with me over a pony. I don't know if you remember that. He won, I believe. But that was an introduction to what actually the working group wound up doing, is a negotiation. And I wanted to share with you how that went. So the purpose, are we working on it? Okay, thank you. Okay, great. So the purpose of the collaborative process was for the working group to create recommendations to the department for incorporation and for your consideration for a revised CWD management plan based on meaningful public input and especially also science. The factors that we had to bear in mind right off the bat was that the purpose of the process was for Game and Fish to learn from the public and the working group. Ultimately, if CWD is to be effectively managed in this state, Game and Fish wanted to be able to experiment, and experimentation and implementation were most likely going to be long-term propositions. And the process allowed Game and Fish to find out, given the need for experimentation and how much time is involved, where the public social license would be for any kind of actions. In return, Game and Fish wanted to be able to share what they can and what they cannot do and why. Regarding access to process, if a member of the public could not attend in person, the first public workshop was always videoed and put online so that there was as much exposure as possible. So the process started with inviting members of the public to apply to be working group members. We also created selection criteria, which I will share with you in a minute. The steering committee was formed, which had the people that Scott just mentioned, as well as Josh and Kristen, who were amazing co-chairs and still are. The process was proposed to the steering committee and then later on to the entire working group, and it was finalized by the steering committee and presented to the working group. We also had a charter, which are basically the guidelines of how the working group worked, and that was very quickly adopted by the entire working group. And these are the selection items that were used. So in order to, I think we received about 150 applications. And in order, so that enthusiasm for the subject was wonderful. But it took quite a while to be able to figure out how we were going to get it down to approximately 30. And as Brian said, I think it was closer to 32. But each member had to be willing to share information with and from the working group, with the public, as well as the organizations, groups, affiliations, and businesses they represent. So they had a responsibility to not only work with us in the working group, but take that information back to their constituents, if you will, and make sure that we get the feedback from the constituents back to the working group. They had to be able to attend all working group meetings and participate in local CWD public meetings. They had to have the ability and willingness to use scientific, social, economic, and technical information in the deliberations and recommendation process. They also had to have the ability and willingness to negotiate in good faith during the working group process. So really put all the effort into this collaborative process. And then the guideline for something like this is always, from a collaborative standpoint, find out, make sure that the people who can be affected by the outcome, as well as the people who can affect the outcome, that they are involved. And then the applicant selected what stakeholder type they were part of. And then the process looked like this. It looks very busy. It was very busy. So we had our first internal public meeting, and that was in April of last year. Then we had the first series of public workshops, and the question there was, what are the issues that need to be considered? And what are ideas that you want the working group to consider? Then this working group went to work based on the input that we received from that public workshop. And during those working group meetings, they went through identifying what are the issues, what are the interests, what are options for recommendations, and then finalizing the recommendations. Then the Game and Fish went to work and compiled their draft plan. Then we had the final set of workshops in December where that final draft plan was presented. I heard, and this is my perspective, but I wanted to share with you the consistent messaging that I heard from Wyoming Game and Fish to your constituents. One was, I constantly heard Game and Fish say, we understand your worries, that we will hunt our way out of this. That was a subject that came immediately, and it's a big concern and was thoroughly discussed. I also heard them say, it's our, as Scott just said, it's our mission to conserve Wyoming's wildlife, and any management action will meet that objective. And also, we share your fears. There was a lot of sharing of fears in this process, understandably, and Game and Fish, I heard Game and Fish share that with them. I also heard them say that strategies in the plan are management options. They are management options to consider. Whether and how they are implemented is up to local wildlife managers and publics, because one of the things that the working group learned is that the situation is different in different areas of the state, as Hank just presented. I also heard them say, we understand your concerns / fears that significant measures could be taken without adequate or appropriate data and planned outcomes. That was another big topic for the working group. The other thing that I heard Game and Fish say is there are risks. This is a very tough spot for the agency. There are many uncertainties, but we have been charged to address the CWD as stewards of your wildlife, and doing nothing is against the public's desire, and they had numbers to support that. So the results from the first set of public workshops, we had 146 people meet in those 5 locations. And the question that everybody went into breakout groups, and the answers of which were fed directly into the working group, was what ideas would you like the CWD working group to consider in developing management options for CWD in Wyoming? I made a spreadsheet with all the results. There were hundreds, 200 and something options that came out of that process. I categorized them and gave them the very first day to the working group to get to work on. And they received 273 management options, which resulted in 50 categories of issues. Then, after the second draft, or after the draft plan was compiled by the agency, in the second set of workshops, we had 143 participants, so almost exactly the same. And there, the recommendations were presented and amended based on the input that we received from the public. The main categories of comments and questions from those meetings touched on disease management, environmental transmission, feed grounds, information needs, license reimbursement, research sampling, and testing. And then finally, the results from the actual working group. I just want to say, I was very impressed with this working group. I have facilitated task forces for Governor Meade. I have been facilitating for 30 years. And this group had a really tough situation to deal with because there was so much uncertainty. On the one hand, the scientists that we had on board did everything they could to give the best available science, but on the other hand, there also was a great deal of uncertainty. So if you add uncertainty with pretty emotional issue, lots of complexity, that could make for a very difficult collaborative situation. But this group really, really went to bat for Wyoming on this issue, I believe. So I just wanted to say that. And as a result, I think the results are clear that they did do all that hard work. They came up with 54 draft recommendations out of those 273 options that they received from the public. Every word that you see in the recommendations was created by the working group and vetted by the working group. I mean, it was a lot of hard work in terms of language, which happened over 4 two-day meetings, which is actually really fast, considering the amount of complexity they had to deal with. And then, wonderfully, they were able to come up with 40 consensus recommendations, 7 recommendations that received consensus with major reservations, which are outlined, And we know which people have those major reservations so that you can take that into consideration. And there were 7 recommendations that did not receive any consensus. All of this you can see in Appendix B of your plan. And then I have one final slide with just some last thoughts. Already touched on the hard work. I think the efforts, the amount of good faith negotiation that took place is really clear in the number of consensus recommendations. I've touched on the uncertainty, and finally, I just wanted to thank you and Director Nesbitt for the great honor of being able to facilitate this. Thank you. Any questions for me?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Western. I guess before we actually get into the plan, which Justin Benfit will present, I'm going to ask Kristen Gunther and Josh Corsi, the CWD working group co-chairs, to come up and give a perspective of the plan and the working group process. Thank you, Scott. President Doobie, members of the commission, Director Nesbitt. Jessica spent a length of time talking about the working group. And I think it's worth me getting into some of the details specific to the working group. I'm sorry, remind me. I needed some notes. But, you know, first of all, Director Nesbitt, thank you for your leadership on this. You truly have shown, it's a testament, in my opinion, that you have taken the mission of conserving wildlife and serving people to heart. The commission, Commissioner Craig, for your efforts to want to move this forward to get it to this level really showcases the genuine concern and regard for taking action. And to me, that defines leadership. And I think that goes across the board to the entire commission. When you're going to put together a working group of various stakeholders to tackle an issue like this that doesn't have a silver bullet, that's a task just in itself. And so I do want to get into some of the weeds a little bit on the working group itself, of which 11 are here in attendance today. 3 will be joining by Zoom. But what does this group look like? We have a state senator, 3 county commissioners, a representative from DEQ, representative from the Department of Ag, Department of Transportation, Conservation District, sports people, conservation group, state veterinarian, scientists from the University of Wyoming, representative from the U.S. Forest Service, Game Commission, Commissioner Schmidt, Wyoming Outfitters and Guides Association, Grand Teton National Park, landowners, and Game and Fish. I think that's a pretty broad and diverse group of stakeholders, and really set the course for putting together a team that would tackle an issue such as this that has so much controversy. I think specific to the plan, I would like to, I don't want to jump into the plan as I know that is our 2020 Employee of the Year's job, and much deserving of that, I will say. But I do want to convey to you that on page 17 of the plan, I think this really gets to the bottom of this. That the department therefore consider and evaluate management actions to slow the spread and or reduce prevalence of the disease statewide while maintaining healthy and sustainable wildlife populations. And I think when Dr. Western mentioned how many people applied for the working group, that struck the chord with me as to why I applied, why I wanted to be a part of this. If this is something that is going to have an impact potentially for the health and the sustainability of what I hold to be most dear, no pun intended, that this would be the opportunity to be engaged. And I think that's what we do in Wyoming. I think we put our best foot forward to be a part of the solution. And with that comes trying to identify the problem. And this one has a lot of unknowns. That being said, I think the efforts by the department and all of the meetings across the Cowboy State to engage the public was probably the only way to go about this, to do it right. And I think within that, as mentioned on page 17, it does state, as such, the department will not proceed with any CWD management actions unless broad and diverse public support exists. Public support is imperative. I think that's worth repeating. On this issue, public support is absolutely imperative,
and localized public input and education processes will be developed as necessary. This management plan isn't a done deal. There's no doubt about it. This is something that will, President Doobie, you mentioned it earlier on another issue, but this is adaptive management right here. This will continue to evolve. This will continue to require input. This will continue to require engagement. And I hope that the department continues to use this diverse group of stakeholders as a working group to continue to be a part of that because we're willing and we care about this and want to be a part of this. With that, I'll turn it over to Kristen.
Thank you, President Doobie, members of the commission. I will keep my comments brief in the interest of getting to the plan. But I just want to say again, just kind of echo Josh's comments and first offer my thanks to you, as well as to the department, who I think it's to their great credit how much support they offered to the public working group through this process. They engaged the way they were asked to engage. They made every effort to answer. If we had requests for more information, if we wanted to hear from experts, if we wanted to hear about a specific topic, they made the effort and went above and beyond to make sure that we had the resources that we requested for these conversations. So I wanted to commend that. And I also just wanted to commend the work overall of the group, of the 31 people who engaged in this process. This was, as Dr. Western mentioned, this was not a group that shied away from thorny conversations, and this was a group that really did the work. And I just want to underscore the fact that whether a comment came to us once or whether we heard it 100 different ways, we took it to heart and we looked at it and we thought about it and we considered it. And really, as was mentioned by Dr. Western earlier, the real origin of our work in this group is looking at diverse public comment from around the state and thinking about how we could build those forward into recommendations for the department's use. And everyone took their work seriously. Folks checked in with their constituencies regularly between meetings and took on independent projects to make sure we were getting the full scope of interest. We had one working group member who actually thought, well, wait, I wonder what game meat processors have to say about some of this. So she took it upon herself to cold call every game meat processor that she could find a number for and develop a spreadsheet that she shared with the group just to add that insight. So there was a real dedication to this process and to doing the work and getting it done. And when you think about a group that's working that hard, I think you can absolutely rest assured that the consensus that we found, the language that was carefully crafted, that came out of a real commitment and a real seriousness about this task. And just in closing, I want to echo, of course, we all know there's going to be uncertainties, but again, as Josh said, this is about building a toolbox for our managers. And that's the spirit in which we did our work, I think, building a toolbox for our managers to be able to be proactive now about this disease because we can no longer wait to take action. And unfortunately, our esteemed state vet, Dr. Jim Logan, is not here with us today, but I did get his permission to share a quote from him as he's infinitely more wise than I am. And I thought this sort of spoke to the moment we're in. Jim had to say, "It isn't a perfect world, and any disease issue in wildlife presents a myriad of challenges that have no easy solution, thereby making it imperative that we continue working together as concerned citizens to modify management efforts as new information becomes available. There are no other states that have reached perfection in their CWD management plans either, in spite of countless hours of study and collaborative work." And what I think that speaks to is the fact that this is the beginning of a conversation. This is a door that's been open for the public to be engaged, to remain engaged. I know there are a lot of folks that are passionate about this issue that want to work side by side with the department to meet the challenges posed by CWD. So that's what I have to say today. Thank you for your support of this work. Thanks to the department and to the working group members for all of the efforts made to date. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Justin, you about ready? Okay, before Justin gets up, I just want to echo Josh and Kristen's comments about the working group. On behalf of the department, I want to give our sincere thanks to the working group for taking on this challenging CWD issue, including their time to attend meetings, learn all things CWD related, and the hard lift of consensus on issues that they and other constituents are passionate about. They did this on their own time and expense. So a big clap for them for taking this on. With that, we're going to get into the actual plan. Justin will present that. got a PowerPoint, kind of gets into the details, and so we'll get that going.
Okay, thank you, President Doobie, members of the commission, and Director Nesbitt. We're going to go through our draft Wyoming Chronic Wasting Disease Management Plan. Some of this information is going to be a little bit redundant because Hank and others may have covered it, but nevertheless, I think some of it bears repeating. We're also going to go through a few things for the benefit of the public that may not be as familiar with the plan or the background of this disease. So with that, Janet, you're on the, okay, you guys hear me all right? So the plan is broken out into the following sections. So we have a guide to the plan, goals and purpose, an introduction, surveillance and monitoring section, disease management strategies, and we have an elk feed ground section, which I'm going to skip over today. Brad's going to cover that when I'm done. And then the section devoted to research and coordination, our internal CWD management team, human health, and then communication and outreach. Then we also have a few appendices associated with that. I'm not going to go into detail in those. One is just based on how we calculate statistically adequate sample sizes for our prevalence estimates. And then Appendix B covers a lot of the information that Jessica and Scott covered regarding our collaborative process and our working group recommendations. And then I will touch a little bit on Appendix C, which is a 2019 hunter perspective survey. So I'm going to try to be as concise as possible, but I also don't want to rush through this and do this plan a disservice. So here we go. So we start off with a general guide to this plan, and this guide just provides a very brief summary of the plan's contents. And then more importantly, it focuses on how this plan will be implemented. As folks have attested to, there's a lot of uncertainty with this plan, with this disease, and how to manage it. And one of the things that we kind of wanted to assuage right away was just to put in perspective how we intend to implement this plan. There are some folks that are concerned, should this plan be adopted today, that there's going to be drastic measures taken starting tomorrow. And I really want to stress that in this plan, and nor in any discussions that we've had within our agency, there is no statewide or regional approach. Rather, this plan simply provides an array of potential management tools for local wildlife managers to consider. And this section also stresses that whatever CWD management strategies we're going to implement have to be specifically tailored to local herd and disease dynamics. There's a host of things that we have to consider with respect to where we choose to implement these strategies. And as Josh so eloquently stated, and you're going to hear me repeat this multiple times, these strategies are only going to be implemented in areas where there's broad and diverse public support. That public support is absolutely vital. And I would also like to remind folks too, especially with respect to any strategies regarding hunter harvest, remind folks that, there's a public process behind all of this. The commission has to approve any big game management prescriptions that the department proffers. So, and that will include CWD related hunter harvest strategies. And then, this section also stipulates that it's incumbent upon us as managers to widely disseminate the results of any CWD harvest or CWD management strategies that we should implement. It's very crucial that we share what we learn over time, both within the agency, within the constituents across the state, but also outside the state of Wyoming with other universities and wildlife management agencies. And lastly, this section kind of highlights the need for continued research and coordination. With all of this, we certainly have learned a lot about this disease over the past few decades, but unfortunately, there's still a lot more we have to learn. So, goals and purpose. Why are we here? Well, as we've stated, and others before me have stated, CWD has increased in prevalence and distribution throughout Wyoming. And we now know that populations are being impacted, especially when prevalences get significant enough. In some of our herds, especially in the southeast part of the state, we feel like we're seeing some long-term and significant impacts to population performance. And frankly, the department is not engaged in any meaningful CWD management today. Some folks before me have already talked about the direction that was really spurred upon by this body, and in particular Commissioner Crank, about there was some frustration mounting that we really haven't done anything to manage this disease, and frankly, that was accurate. And so this plan represents our best shot at the beginning to go down this road. And so, also, why are we here? So, you know, we have emerging science and management data that's came out in places that suggest some of these management strategies are promising. Some of this information was culminated in a 2018 document put out by the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. We took that to heart. That document also served as kind of a springboard for our collaborative process. And frankly, it's incumbent upon us managers to explore ways to manage this disease for the long-term health and sustainability of our wildlife populations. And one of the sentiments that we hear quite often, that I've heard repeatedly over the last couple of years, and in thinking about this and discussing it with publics, is that we shouldn't do anything, and we can't do anything, and that we should let nature take its course. Well, doing nothing is a decision, and frankly, we've decided to do nothing for a long time. But it's really no longer acceptable in our view. And this sentiment was very strongly echoed in our 2019 Hunter Perspective Survey. So this 2019 Hunter Perspective Survey kicked off, this helped us kick off our collaborative process. Our internal CWD working group took a survey that was originated in Colorado. We modified it accordingly so it best fit Wyoming's model, but essentially we tried to make it very similar to what was done in Colorado. And that will enable us to compare the results of what we learned in Wyoming and compare that to what folks in Colorado were reporting. And so what we did is we surveyed 2,000 resident and 1,000 non-resident deer hunters. Out of those 3,000 hunters, we had 1,201 respondents, and 751 of them were resident, and 450 of them were non-resident. And these were just deer hunters. These were hunters that had filled out our harvest survey in the years 2017 and 2018. And then we broke those, we partitioned those survey respondents, or excuse me, the folks that we surveyed, by whether or not they hunted in a high prevalence area or a low prevalence area. And for the purposes of this, is how we define that was a high prevalence area was, did they hunt deer hunt areas that had a 10% or greater prevalence, and in a low prevalence area was, did they hunt, if they hunted in hunt areas with 5% or less prevalence. One of the interesting things to note when you go through all the survey results is the attitudes as they responded to various questions, whether it's what we should do or what are their concerns. There was actually very little difference between those folks that reported in hunting in high prevalence hunt areas versus low prevalence areas. When asked what was their predominant concern, with respect to CWD and increasing CWD prevalence, it was by far and away the vast majority expressed concern over how is this going to translate into potentially lost deer hunting opportunity. 87% responded that was their primary concern. Of course, that invokes a whole suite of issues in terms of that's concern over the resource, how it affects them, the whole gamut. And also a large majority agreed that effort should be taken to reduce CWD. And then we also asked them a series of questions about what are some of the proposed actions that we should take to combat CWD. And these questions range the gamut from, should we pursue late season buck harvest? Should we reduce deer density? Should we reduce overall just buck and bull numbers? Things like that. And by far and away, this stuck out that the most unacceptable decision that we could make would be to do nothing. Taking no action was by far and away the most unacceptable. So as far as what was acceptable, well, CWD management action, or the most acceptable CWD management action that the public felt that we provided was using special hunts to remove deer in localized areas, essentially addressing kind of hot spots. And then that was followed by a reduction in the total population, and then one of the more least favorable ones was an increasing number of late season buck licenses. And then the last point I'd like to make about that is that the majority, were pretty loud and clear that they indicated that we should be striking a balance between controlling CWD and preserving hunting opportunities. So, on to the introduction. I'm going to go over this kind of quickly because I'm sure you guys have heard it for Hank, but for some other folks' benefit. A real quick timeline. So CWD was first described in 1967. It was then identified as a transmissible spongiform encephalopathy in 1978 by Dr. Beth Williams. It was then documented a year later at our Seville Research Center in Wyoming. And you fast forward to 1981, it was documented in Toronto Zoo and then in free-ranging deer in Colorado. And then we didn't have our first case in a wild deer in Wyoming until 1985 in southeastern Wyoming. Followed that up a year later in 1986, we documented in an elk, again in southeastern Wyoming. And then there was kind of a lull, and fast forward 10 years to 1996, and it really became apparent that this disease was spreading, the distribution was spreading all over as it became found in Canadian provinces like Saskatchewan and in South Dakota, Oklahoma, et cetera, and then even in South Korea. And then you get to 2002, and national concern starts to rapidly increase about CWD. It became documented in a whole host of other states, Midwestern and even East Coast states. And really, we also noticed a lot of that concern even here in Wyoming. So you get in the early 2000s, which is about the time I started working for the outfit. We had a case where in Wisconsin, there was a hunter that was diagnosed with Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which is the human variant of a TSE, of a prion disease. And that case was potentially thought to have been linked to that hunter eating infected game. Well, you know, that was never proven to be the case, but as what that did was that sparked some national paranoia about CWD, especially from the human health perspective. And you couple that with, I think we had West Nile virus and SARS both emerging in Wyoming, or excuse me, in the United States. And paranoia and concern just really started to increase in the early 2000s. And then fast forward a decade later, really that concern kind of waned again. We still continue, you know, in the country, they still continue to document the spread of the disease to other states. But really, folks started caring a whole lot less, especially from the human health aspect. And we were not really out ahead of it in terms of we had not yet started to notice impacts from this disease on our deer herds yet. Well, beginning in about 2010, that's, you know, we had a whitetail study southwest of Glenrock be published, and then we also had some work that was done south of Douglas and mule deer, and coupled that with what some other states were learning, and it started to become apparent that this disease is actually potentially having significant impacts on our wildlife populations. And so for us, that's really kind of shifted our focus. We certainly hear from the public all the time about concerns of human health, but we're trying to message, hey, this is a big deal to your deer herds especially. And we really think some of the impacts are significant now. So then fast forward to 2016 to present, the last 5 years, continuing to document spread. Now globally, it's been found in all the Scandinavian countries, 4 Canadian provinces, etc. So you guys have probably seen this map from Hank before. This is just a simple CWD distribution and heat map in the state. This is from 1998 to 2005. So the red dots, you know, just mark positive locations, and the darker blue is the density. So this is after, you know, 8 years of surveying. 1998 kind of marks when our more intensive sampling efforts actually began. So that's why we're starting here. You'll notice the vast majority of our cases were still clustered in the southeastern border of the state, with a little bit of emergence up in the Bighorn Basin, some in Johnson County, and then up towards Weston and Cook County. Now we fast forward over the last 15 years, from 2006 to 2019. So here we are, we've documented incredible spread and distribution throughout the state. We're now seeing fairly high density, you know, clusters of this disease and high prevalences in areas like the project herd that was brought up around Riverton today. Throughout the Bighorn Basin, on the eastern flank of the Bighorns, from Casey to Sheridan, and more in the Sierra Madre and the Snowy Range. Clearly, Some of this is an artifact of also sampling more and increasing our surveillance efforts. But we also know, and certainly based on the prevalences that we're seeing, that this disease is undoubtedly spreading and it's becoming more and more prevalent where it's established. So that's kind of it for the background. The plan has a little bit more background information just on the basics of the disease. So then on to surveillance and monitoring. I was gonna actually go into a lot more detail here, but Hank covered some of the things I was gonna say. You know, we draw a distinction between surveillance and monitoring. You know, surveillance is kind of what we consider where we're trying to detect just the distribution of this disease, where it is and where it is not. And then monitoring is where we're shifting our efforts more towards better measuring what the true prevalence is on a herd unit level. So to do that, you know, we have three primary sources of testing. We have hunter harvested cervid, so hunter harvested deer and elk. I guess I should back up every time I say the word cervid. I mean members of the deer family. So hunter harvested cervids, that's what we predominantly use for our prevalence estimates, because in theory, these are the most randomly sampled animals. In theory, hunters do not know whether or not that animal has disease. Now we have roadkill deer that we also use. We primarily have used that to document distribution of the disease. It's a great way to look for this disease, especially in areas where we have not yet documented it. But we don't use that data in our prevalence estimates, and that's because roadkill, you know, in an area where you have CWD, it's been well demonstrated that CWD positive deer have a higher likelihood of getting hit by a vehicle than CWD negative deer. And so that can bias our prevalence estimates. And then we have targeted surveillance. And when we say targeted surveillance, is what we mean is we have a member of the public or a landowner or whoever call one of our wardens or biologists up and say, hey, I have a sick deer or elk out of my place. It's exhibiting clinical signs of CWD. Would you guys come check it out? And in that case, then we'll euthanize that animal, take the appropriate tissue samples, and send it to Hank for disease testing. So, like I think Hank fielded a question, but you know, we do have some good prevalence and distribution data in many of our herds, but you know, it's lacking in others. And you know, there are some questions about front country and that Commissioner Schmidt asked, and where a lot of our information is focused, and you know, there's some real challenges with that, and we have to recognize in the surveillance and monitoring strategy that there are some of our herds we're likely never going to get really good statistically adequate data. Some of our herds, we just don't offer enough deer licenses to even get there. And to Commissioner Bird's question, you know, another thing I'd like to point out with respect to female data, this is a very good question, but we don't harvest female mule deer in most of our herd units in the state, so that makes it a challenge too. That was also something that was borne out in our collaborative process, was we had some working group members say you guys need to do a better job of trying to get a handle on female data, and so we're looking at augmenting some of our sampling efforts to pick up more roadkills with females and things like that too. But it's a real challenge. It could be logistically a challenge based on the way we hunt our herd unit, the number of licenses we have, or for folks over in the mountainous part of the state, you know, it could be a real challenge to get CWD samples out of a backcountry elk, for example. So like Hank said, we're gonna try to focus on measuring prevalence to the extent we can with our herds around the state on a rotating 4 to 5 year basis. And then we're going to continue to surveil for this disease where we haven't documented it. Unfortunately, that's becoming a smaller and smaller area. With this, one of the challenges that we also have to acknowledge is the logistics and the lab capacity that we have. When we embarked on this ambitious effort a year ago, some of us were quite concerned that we were going to overwhelm the lab. Unfortunately, we didn't. I wish we did. So as of now, you know, we're not so much concerned about the lab capacity, but logistics do present a challenge for us. One of the challenges I'd just like to make folks aware is as we rotate this monitoring strategy around the state, we may, and I'll speak a lot from the Casper region perspective because it's what I know best, but let's just take an area like the Black Hills. So we have our folks set up, we have CWD technicians, we have wardens, biologists, everyone keyed in on collecting and maximizing samples up in the Black Hills for a 1 to 2 year period. Well, we can do a really good job up there because we harvest enough deer. But then, as that priority rotates around the region, all of a sudden we're doing something west of Casper. Well, we've also created an expectation with the public that, hey, we're going to have a game and fish person. We're going to have a guy or a gal in a red shirt there to sample my deer when I kill them 3 years from now. And that may not be the case. And so that's also one of the logistical challenges that we're trying to deal with as well. As while we're trying to focus and rotate our focus around these regions, every time we really establish a presence, we also create that public expectation that we're going to be there in perpetuity. And it's just something that we have to be aware of and deal with it as we can. So now on to the disease management strategies. So this is really kind of the heart of the plan. So before I get into the actual strategies, there's a few things I'd like to review. Well, I say, and we all recognize, and certainly anyone that served on our collaborative process would also point out, there's a great deal about this disease that we still don't know. But there is a lot of things that we do know now. We know that populations are being impacted to varying degrees, and it's also based on prevalence and how long that disease has been established there. We know that unequivocally this disease is expanding in both distribution and prevalence. We know that in the vast majority of cases, bucks have about twice the prevalence of does. And we know that within bucks, prevalence is the highest in mature bucks. We know that where we have overlapping whitetail deer, prevalence in whitetail can meet or exceed that of mule deer. We know that environmental transmission, so that's accumulation of those CWD prions in the environment, whether it's in water, soil, infected carcasses, shed through urine, feces, things like that. We know environmental transmission is likely playing a much more significant role the higher the prevalence is. That really complicates the management of this. These prions can reside in soil for an undetermined amount of time, but we know it's a very long time. I think we know scrape bee can reside in the soil, which is the sheep version of CWD. It's a prion disease in sheep for, I believe, like 13 or 17 years. We know that in elk, for whatever reason, prevalence doesn't vary by sex like it does in deer. We have really good data to support that. We also know that sympatric elk, and when I say sympatric, I mean just kind of overlapping elk that reside in the same general area as deer. They don't exhibit prevalence as high as deer. So a case in point in that is like the Laramie range, where long-term our prevalences will run anywhere from 30 to 45% in our buck mule deer. Those same overlapping elk at Laramie Peak, long-term we run 6 to 7%. And then we also know that there's really little information that's published on what truly is effective management. But that's why we're here today. We need to add to this growing body. And we do know enough about this disease to warrant some level of management action. So I think Mr. Corsi kind of touched on this too, but this is adaptive management. It's kind of a buzzword for we'd like to implement some strategies, learn from those strategies, and then modify our feature application for those strategies based on what we learn, and hopefully continue to improve. But we still intend to strategically apply these actions. They're always going to be on the best available data and science that we have at the time. It's not going to be completely just shooting in the dark or throwing something in the wall and seeing what sticks. But it is going to be a learning experience for us. And also, I'd like to point out that we're not really proposing anything that's not grounded in accepted wildlife management practices. So we're going to take, conventional approaches to the extent possible. Some of these management actions, though, I have to be very clear, and we've tried to really articulate this throughout the collaborative process, is that some of these management actions are experimental in nature. We don't know if they're going to work, and it would be disingenuous for us to say otherwise. But we think they're worth trying. We think they have a good chance of working. But that broad and diverse public support is so critical. If we don't have it, we're not going to get anywhere. And not only do we have to have it, we have to have broad and diverse public support at the local level when we propose a project, when we solicit public input for project design, we have to clearly articulate what we want to accomplish with this project, articulate what resulting, say, for example, deer densities may be, or what levels of harvest we're prescribing. And we have to maintain that public support. Because if that public support erodes halfway through the project, we're not going to learn anything. And unfortunately, that's been, that circumstance has unfolded in other states where management actions were taken, public support diminished, and then the actions were truncated too early before they could really, learn the effects of what their management action was doing. The challenge with that is these experimental management actions have to be implemented and evaluated over a very long time frame. In a lot of cases, we're talking 5 to 10 plus years, and so it's critical to maintain that support throughout, and that's a challenge, but it's one we think we're up to. And the reason why these projects have to be done over such a long period of time is just due to the slow, progressive nature of this disease. It doesn't spread like wildfire. It doesn't result in a true epizootic outbreak like a blue tongue outbreak where a whole bunch of deer die at one point. And then you also have to be able to measure whether or not you're impacting real meaningful change in subsequent generations of deer. So for those reasons, we have to implement these projects over a very long time frame. And then, another facet of this that really came up quite a bit was, well, we should only do this in areas where we really are seeing impacts from this disease. And that's also kind of a conundrum for us because, well, let's start with, when we're seeing the most impacts at these higher prevalences at 20 and 30%. And some papers even model and suggest impacts are occurring at prevalences even lower than that, like such as 13%. But when we have our higher prevalence areas, particularly in the southeast part of the state, we also have a public that's very in tune, and also game and fish personnel. And we just asked Martin Hicks there in the back what he thinks about managing CWD. He's been in Wheatland for, oh golly, almost 20 years now. And not only is he sick and tired of seeing deer tip over from this disease, but so is his constituency. So are his landowners, so are the hunters. Those folks are, in a lot of cases, are ready to do some things. It's a little bit more of a challenge as you say move to areas where this disease has not been well established because the public may or may not be in tune to it. Even some of our game and fish personnel, it's not always in the forefront of their brains, and it's understandably so. But we really recommend trying some of these strategies at all prevalence levels, and that's because, frankly, you may be the most effective at nipping this thing in the bud to the extent possible at lower prevalences. When you start talking about managing CWD in a deer herd with 40+%, and it's been entrenched there for 30+ years that we know of, that's a real challenge, and you have the environmental contamination aspect of it. So, some of the things we'd like to try would be to experimentally try to reduce CWD, but not just stick to the areas where we see it the worst. So what are the main tenets of the disease management strategies of this section? So the three main tenets we have are addressing artificial sources of concentration, hunter-harvest management, and then we have a section devoted to just some additional agency and regulatory actions. So artificial sources of concentration. Well, we define artificial sources of concentration as just kind of unnatural surface concentrations that occur from human-caused attractants or human activity. So in a lot of cases, these are things like urban green spaces, like parks or golf courses or whatever. Or they can also stem from the intentional or unintentional feeding by private citizens, where we have, these cervids concentrating in abnormally high densities. It can really facilitate CWD transmission. It can also increase environmental contamination and animal-to-animal contact. Probably the largest source of artificial concentration would be agricultural operations. I always like to preface this. That doesn't mean I'm picking on ag, because I'm not. This is a reality. I mean, the reality is ag practices are undoubtedly beneficial to cervids in the absence of disease. I mean, if it wasn't for a lot of our landowners providing irrigated hay fields and water, the developments and cover and things like that, I mean, our wildlife undoubtedly benefit from those. But there are certainly some cases where we do have agricultural operations that have some extraordinarily high concentrations of cervids. I mean, I can think of a little center pivot just west of Casper that he has anywhere from 75 to 150 mule-deer and whitetail on just one center pivot every fall. So that's something that we would like to potentially address. Also recognize that, you know, some folks did take exception with the use of the word artificial as it applies to ag fields, because a lot of these have been in existence for over a century, and you could argue whether or not that's artificial anymore, which is actually a fair point. And I'd also bring up that, you know, we recognize that when we're talking about sources of concentration, that with our cervids in particular, elk, but with all our cervid populations, we have natural cervid concentrations too. We get a whole bunch of deer on a winter range, or I can show you a picture of 1,500 elk south of Casper on a winter range. So we recognize that deer and elk congregate naturally. But some of the things that we could potentially do to address these sources of concentration would be to work within the ag community with willing landowners in areas of concern and have some conversations with those folks about potentially decreasing cervid concentrations in those areas. Whether it be through hunting seasons or culling to minimize CWD prevalence. And when I say culling, you know, I'm going to touch on culling a little bit later, just so you guys kind of better understand what we're talking about. You know, another thing that we could do is strive to eliminate the source of that concentration. So in some cases, it may be as simple as fencing off some stack yards, even fencing out some pivots, things like that. Addressing, you know, there are some folks that think that a significant propagator of this disease, if you will, are salt mineral feeders, deer using those and repeatedly licking the same, say, salt block. So there's, you know, could we perhaps put out some mineral feeders that exclude wildlife while not impacting normal agricultural operations? And that would go for any of these discussions we'd have with the willing landowner community. We'd also talk about just kind of developing some informational material regarding the need to reduce cervid concentrations in some of these areas. I can think of that same gentleman that has that pivot west of Casper. The last 3 years in a row, he's called me multiple times in the late summer or early fall when he has 100+ deer on his fields, and he says, "Hey, I got another sick one." And we go out there and dispatch it, and sure as heck, they come out testing positive. And you know, this gentleman's had this the last few years in a row now, and kind of started having some sit downs with this gentleman and talking about maybe the need to do something about it, because while he really likes and enjoys seeing all those deer on his fields, that it's likely a hot spot that he's providing, and so he may be willing to help us try to mitigate that to the extent possible. Another thing we came up with was just assessing the need for some of our water developments. You know, guzzlers came up, and there's a couple things about guzzlers. You know, one could argue that water developments, and deservedly so, water developments actually improve distribution across the landscape and could potentially even reduce animal-to-animal contact as deer are better distributed across the landscape, and that's undoubtedly true. But there are some cases perhaps we need to reevaluate some of our guzzler locations. You know, especially if they're in a hot spot, things like that. And then also explore ways to potentially mitigate prion accumulation. You know, it's been well demonstrated, for example, say that prions tend to naturally bind to clay particles in the soil. You know, perhaps we could do some little low-hanging fruit type things, like put some gravel around these guzzlers and hopefully reduce prion loading in the soil right around them. You know, we're actually now embarking on a formal research project. Dr. Brent Shoemaker is the lead out of the University of Wyoming, and where we're actually going to assess deer and elk use around salt sites. We've got a few sites picked out south of Casper and up by KC and in the Bighorn Basin. That research project is now underway and it's fully funded. Last thing we can do there is work with legislature and local governments to prohibit intentional private feeding of cervids. I'm actually on the docket next week to talk to the Natrona County Commission to do just that. So we do have private feeding bans in municipalities around the state. There's only one countywide ban, and that's in Teton County. But we do know that private feeding inserters, when they get dense enough, could potentially be exacerbating this disease. Anytime, and I should note for the record that anytime the department pursues a feeding ban, we're always talking about excluding traditional ag practices. You know, we're not meant to talk about deer that happen to be on a hay feed line or something like that. So the case for hunter harvest strategies. So increasing harvest of mature bucks later in the season has shown some promise. It's shown promise in Colorado, and it's even while they've actually maintained some high buck ratios. And then there's also some evidence that some density reductions in places like Illinois and New York have worked over the long term, and that they may have slowed the disease in Colorado, Alberta, and Wisconsin. And you couple that again with some of the known facts that we know about this disease, such as prevalence being higher in males and things like that. You know, it does make a case that we should consider exploring some hunter harvest management strategies. So is what we really need, you know, from the commission and then ultimately our publics, is we need permission to try some of these management actions. Again, there's no statewide or regional approach. These strategies will be developed and implemented at the local level. And again, they must have broad and diverse public support and ultimately commission approval. And they need to be implemented over a sufficient amount of time so we can effectively evaluate them. So when I talk about determining these strategies locally, well, we have to tailor them to each herd unit or localized subpopulation where we're going to propose to implement them. So there's a lot to consider here. You know, is the herd that we're talking about, is it migratory or non-migratory? And if it is migratory, what faction of that herd do we need to address? Is the resident herd have a much higher prevalence of this disease versus the migratory segment, or vice versa? You know, what's the productivity of that herd? Think back to the Casper region again. There's a huge difference between the productivity of mule deer in the Black Hills versus in some of that desert country west of Casper. So, you know, if we're going to implement a harvest strategy, you know, what's the resiliency of that herd to bounce back afterwards? What are the densities that they occur in? And then where's that population at relative to its objective? And what's the current hunting season strategy that we employ there? Is it a general license area, or limited quota, or a combination thereof? What are the land ownership patterns? You know, certainly whether it's in all public land, all private land, or a mix of the two, you know, if we can't address the segments of the herd that we need to, we're probably not going to be successful. Just one other consideration. What other cervid species occur there? Are we going to propose a management action in mule deer, but we also have a whole bunch of whitetail and elk right over the top of them? How are we going to address those? You know, what levels of predation do these herd, et cetera, et cetera. The point being is, you know, that's all these considerations, and these are just some examples or reasons why these strategies have to be tailored locally. So the plan is for the department to identify some areas, and I know that's an arbitrary term. It's a little bit nebulous there. You know, whether they be herd units, hunt areas, or subpopulations, to develop some hunting season strategies to reduce or limit CWD. And the three main things that we would address within that would be increasing mature male harvest, reducing populations or densities within areas of concern, or lethal removal strategies to reduce, you know, densities around hotspots. When I say hotspots, you know, I just mean these localized areas where we see an inordinate amount of positive cases coming out. And again, we need to maintain these strategies where we do implement them for a sufficient amount of time so we can adequately evaluate. So if we were to, in an area, increase mature male harvest, what would we do? Well, it's pretty simple. I guess this is straightforward. We would either increase license issuance, extend hunting season length, and particularly if there's a general area, or there's the potential for adding late season hunting. If we were to reduce populations or densities within areas of concern, we could be talking about at a herd unit level, but it's most likely would be within a subpopulation. Again, we have many factors to consider. Where is this herd relative to what the landscape can support, the carrying capacity? What's the distribution of deer or elk across this landscape, and what's the distribution of disease, of CWD, again, the migratory status, population size, et cetera. But we have to be very clear too, if we formulate a strategy like this, if we are going to go down this road, it is going to require some level of sustained female harvest to keep that up. And like I was just saying earlier, in the case of, say, mule deer, there are very few places in the state where we actually harvest female mule deer. So, so depending on where the strategy would be applied, it could certainly generate some concern. With white-tailed deer and elk, that's not so much the case. So lethal removal strategies, if we were going to address hot spots. So this actually got a little bit of attention throughout our collaborative process. And the initial draft, we actually had the term sharpshooter in there. And it was kind of borrowed from a previous version. And it did generate some concern. And when we talk about these practices being grounded within acceptable wildlife management practices, that's one that certainly evokes some concern. And so to clear that up in our second round of meetings, I want to be very clear that whenever we're talking about implementing a strategy like this, hunter harvest will always, unequivocally, be our preferred method of take, without exception. However, there are some cases where we may have some disease hotspots in some of these artificial, like these urban green spaces, like in city limits and things like that. In some of those cases, discharged firearms just simply isn't allowed. So, there have been deer reduction programs around the state. I think right here in Rollins is one of them. I think we've had them in Cody, and I know we have in Sundance. And in those cases, we've actually utilized the police department to take deer. And that's more, in the past, those have been to address nuisance and urban deer issues. They haven't been in the name of the CWD management, but it is a potential tool in the toolbox. Okay, so this plan also directs us, and I think this is a really important step, especially for us wildlife management coordinators and biologists, is that we start considering CWD issues in each annual herd unit report. So every year the biologists compile, we call them JCRs, or job completion reports. We compile these reports at the end of our biological year, and essentially they sum up what are the annual just management issues, data points, et cetera, within a herd. What was your harvest? What were your buck ratios? What were your hunting seasons, et cetera? So we compile those herd unit reports every year. Well, this plan will direct us to actually consider some CWD issues. And if we're going to do that and do it right, we need to, those herd unit reports have to have a discussion of what's your prevalence and how good is your CWD data. We don't want to start basing CWD management decisions off of poor data. Or 95% of your samples coming from 5% of your hunt area, or your samples well distributed within the area, discussions like that. And so we need to also, what's the distribution of the disease in this herd? Where are your buck or your bull ratios in relation to CWD? And also the herd's defined management strategy. You guys are obviously all aware of it. For members of the public that may not be, every herd has either a special or recreational management designation. And that basically directs us to manage for a target amount of buck or bull ratios in a herd. Just to illustrate it. So in the case of mule deer, a recreational management strategy would say we're going to manage for between 20 and 29 bucks per 100 does post-season, in addition to that population estimate. And then in a special management area, we're going to manage for between 30 and 45 bucks per 100 does. Well, where are we at with buck ratios, not only in relation to that management strategy, but in relationship to the CWD prevalence that we have? I have a herd west of Casper where we're commonly, in the mid-40s for buck ratios, and we're starting to see more and more CWD. Is it prudent to manage for buck ratios that high? So those are just some discussions that we need to have. CWD management strategies that are being planned or implemented need to be codified in these herd unit reports, and then whatever relevant progress reports are associated with that. And again, these all have to be done with consideration to the actual defined population objective and managing the herd. Last things on this section would be this is something we do as a routine. All of our field personnel routinely engage landowners to maintain or increase hunter access, but this can certainly help facilitate some disease management. Our Access Yes program is really pivotal in securing access to private lands. And also, again, it's incumbent upon us to disseminate formal assessments of any hunter harvest management actions that we employ, whether they worked or whether they didn't, because we need to foster the broader understanding of CWD management and also help out our counterparts in other states. So how will this be applied in Wyoming? Well, harvest strategies, any harvest strategies we're talking about to significantly reduce buck or overall cervid densities are not going to be proposed on a large scale without published research indicating that they're viable. Essentially, we're not going to take this show on the road with a statewide or a large scale or regional approach until we know they work, but we still would like permission to try them in some areas. And again, that's up to our local publics and ultimately you all. Should we start to have some luck? Well, I shouldn't say it that way. Should we start to realize that some of these strategies are proven effective over the long term? Well, it's also incumbent upon us to update the public and you guys accordingly. And then at that point, we may be ready to nominate additional areas for some hunter harvest management strategies. Again, pending public support and commission. So the other thing, the way I kind of personally envision some of this being applied in Wyoming is I've always kind of felt like there's 3 tiers to this. So there's some really low-hanging fruit we can talk about. Some of that low-hanging fruit doesn't need to result in some large-scale public input process. It may be fencing out the gentleman's pit at West of Casper that I'm talking about. We don't need a public process for that. We need a willing landowner and data to suggest that it's a good thing to do. The second tier of this management would be within the confines of an existing management framework. So again, getting back to those defined management strategies. Should I be managing for $45 per 100 does west of Casper when maybe I should be managing more for like $35 per 100 does? But it's still within the confines of our established management framework, and there's still public input associated for that through our traditional season setting processes. And then if we're talking about any significant harvest that's going to result in a meaningful and significant reduction of either mature males, bucks or bulls, or overall densities, well, in that case, those are going to require intensive public outreach efforts to garner and maintain that support. And I know I've reiterated that multiple times, but again, we're going to have to clearly articulate our harvest goals, and we're going to have to develop them with public input, and we're going to have to do it for a sufficient amount of time. So, CWD sample submission. So this is another topic that came up quite a little bit in our collaborative process. We had a lot of folks on this process very adamant that saying, hey, if we're going to give you guys permission to do this, if you guys are going to go do something as controversial as reduce buck mule deer numbers, by golly, you better understand what effect that's having on prevalence, and you guys better maximize the number of samples that you take. And then it evoked, conversation of whether or not we should have mandatory sampling and things like that. But you can bet your bottom dollar that if and when or where we ever implement any of these types of strategies, we are going to do everything in our power to maximize the number of samples that we get. So in a lot of cases, it's going to require a whole bunch of samples so we can adequately detect whether or not these strategies are working. We can utilize a combination of voluntary or mandatory sample submission. Voluntary is always going to be the preferred method, but there may be a time where we have to invoke mandatory sampling. And just as a reminder, we do have the regulatory authority to invoke mandatory sampling if necessary under our Chapter 2 regulation. So that's it with hunter harvest strategies. The rest of this actually goes fairly quick. I know it's late in the day. You guys are probably tired of hearing me already, but so as far as additional agency and regulatory actions, we're going to continue to engage DEQ, Department of Transportation, Wyoming County Commissioners Association, solid waste operators, et cetera, just to facilitate proper disposal of carcasses. This is something that was already done. Director Nesbitt actually convened a meeting last December in Casper with these entities, and we had some good discussion, and I think we still have a little bit more work to do, but I think we're heading in the right direction. We're going to continue to enforce Wyoming's statutory prohibition of surrogate ownership. You know, Wyoming has probably the most stringent laws in the country regarding private ownership of wildlife and captive surrogates. We will continue to educate hunters on and enforce our existing Chapter 2 regulation governing the importation, exportation, and transportation of cervid remains and cervid parts. Continue with the targeted removal of deer and elk that are exhibiting clinical signs of CWD. Again, continue to collaborate with our counterparts in other states and federal and other agencies, universities, et cetera, regarding effective CWD suppression strategies. You know, while we would like to add to this growing body of work, there's certainly some things we can learn for some actions that are now going on in other states as well. And we'll continue to engage taxidermists and meat processors regarding just the proper handling and disposal of carcasses and parts. We're actually supposed to attend the big Taxidermist Association conference in April, but that got canceled due to obvious reasons. We're going to continue to enforce the Wildlife Division's directive that, within the agency, that any deer or elk carcass that comes into our possession, regardless of how it came into our possession, for example, say a confiscated deer from a wildlife law enforcement case, that those carcasses will be tested for CWD and will only be donated if they test negative. We're going to continue to partner with the University of Wyoming with work that they're doing. This is kind of Hank and Sam's shop as far as they're putting a lot of work into developing a statewide genetic database so that we can genotype deer and elk across the state with respect to a specific part of their genetic code that codes for prions. And then another recommendation was to pursue the authority to actually regulate the use of cervid deer. Okay, so that's it for that section. Brad's going to get to the Elk Creek grounds. Again, the rest of these go really quick. So research, again, unfortunately, there's an awful lot of unknowns about this disease, and this is not a comprehensive list on this presentation that's in the plan. I just wanted to touch on a few, but some of the research priorities that came up through our collaborative process was highlighting the need to, this is obvious, this is a really important one, but evaluate the efficacy of these hunter harvest strategies. We need to actually do some pretty robust research into this at some point. But we would also, I'd like to stress when I make that point that if we just simply wait for the results of real bona fide research, we may not get much done for the foreseeable future, just given the long time frame it takes to really adequately understand what impact you're having on this disease. So there's a need to evaluate this in a robust manner, but also to try some things and utilize that adaptive management that we talked about and start going down that road as soon as we can. Better understanding the role of cervid genetics and CWD dynamics. There's a certain genotype of deer and elk that live much longer with the disease. Once they get infected, it's still 100% fatal disease. They still die from it. But that has interesting implications on potential genetic selection and how much the disease is transmitted across the landscape and how these herds may adapt over time. Another one would be to assist in the validation of these experimental tests for CWD. So there's some private companies that are coming up with field tests, things like that, to be marketed to the public. There's also the RT Quick test, which is an assay that's a lot more sensitive, that Hank's crew is working on, that has some really good implications for us in the future. Investigate the relative importance of direct versus indirect transmission of CWD prions and that correlation between environmental contamination and animal-to-animal contact. We have the ongoing research to evaluate techniques to reduce concentrations around mineral and salt sites, and explore how habitat selection and habitat improvement projects may influence CWD prevalence and transmission. Studying the effects of interspecific competition on CWD. So not only are the role that, and let's just take mule deer again, what are the role that white-tailed deer and elk having in contributing prions to the environment and potentially facilitating disease transmission, but also what are the impacts of 1,200 elk wintering on mule deer winter range in the Laramie range and further constricting mule deer habitats. So there's some interesting things to learn there. Also the effect and management implications of carnivores with CWD prevalence. There's some interesting work we're starting south of Castor with respect to mountain lions. And it's been looked at in some other states. And then collaboration with the evaluation of CWD vaccines. And I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't say, when this point gets brought up, is that, you know, a lot of folks like to talk about CWD vaccines and they sound great, but, you know, the reality is that the likelihood of developing an effective CWD vaccine is pretty darn slim. And then should one be developed, actually administering that vaccine across the landscape in free-ranging deer and elk would be a pretty tall task. Okay, this plan also codifies our internal CWD management team, and I think this is really important because I think is what this does is it will keep CWD issues in the forefront, at least for us folks that are working on it. Because the last thing I'd like to do, if this plan gets approved, is to have a plan, have all this work that the collaborative process and our game and fish folks put into it, and just have it sit on the shelf and collect dust. We would like this to be a meaningful management plan and an adaptive management plan over time. And to do that, we need to have this team that meets regularly, that helps develop and implement these strategies as needed, chronicles the management actions that have occurred to date, develop, you know, assist with further surveillance monitoring strategies, stay apprised of emerging research, disseminate that emerging information within the agency, and then ensure, and this is really important, but ensure that internal and external communications are occurring as necessary. Second to last slide here. So human health and CWD. So we really have a pretty succinct section here. The Wyoming Game and Fish Department will continue to relay information regarding human health and prion diseases that's put out by the CDC and the Wyoming Department of Health and World Health Organization. They're the human health experts, not us, so we'll continue to stay apprised of emerging information there and update the public accordingly. And I guess it's still worth always mentioning to folks today, there still have been no documented cases of CWD in humans and no direct proof that humans can get CWD, although again, those human health officials recommend CWD positive animals not be consumed. Communication and outreach is the last part of the plan. So the department will create a communication and implementation plan. Janet Millick and some others are hard at work at this. The plan is essentially going to have kind of three main components, and that's going to be recurrent CWD messaging. So what's the distribution of disease, any changes with public health information, monitoring efforts, et cetera, any emerging information regarding impacts to our wildlife populations, any CWD management strategies that are outlined within this plan, and then we'll also assist with local communication for any CWD management actions implemented. And the messaging throughout the communication and outreach, again, because it's within the purview of our department and where our primary concern lies, is that it's going to be messaging where we're seeing and what types of impact we're seeing with some of our local populations. So Jessica touched on this. You know, we acknowledge the public concern. We get it. I've been dealing with this for years now. I've had hundreds of hard conversations with folks, and I understand the concern. Trust me, and I share some myself. This is a tough issue to grapple with. But I'd like to, you know, when we're talking about potentially implementing, say, something like a harvest strategy in a given area where, you know, that deer herd may already be struggling, and it may be struggling because of the disease, or also, you know, in combination with other factors. And so that can be a tough pill for some folks to swallow. But again, I'd like to stress that the management strategies in this plan, they're options, and whether or how they're implemented are up to local wildlife managers, but especially the local public. And there are some risks and uncertainties here. You know, we hear all the time, is the cure worse than the disease? But I would also submit that doing nothing is a risk. It's frankly, based on survey data and also conversations that I'm having, it's unacceptable according to the public. And we really think despite these risks and uncertainties, it's incumbent upon us to try to do some things where we have sufficient public support to do so. Last slide. So just one little quick reminder, again, to reiterate what Jessica said, this plan was developed with extensive public and working group input and approval, and it represents our very best efforts to begin managing this disease based on the best available science and information we have to date. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Justin. Very impressive. I got a question. Mike?
Justin, the strategies that you talked about, those have been tried before with other states. So other states use those same strategies to some degree.
President Dubey, Commissioner Schmidt, so it depends on which strategy you're talking about. So for example, some density reductions have occurred in some areas, and then also some enhanced mule deer harvest has occurred. Probably the best data set with that is in Colorado. They're actually getting ready to publish, and I actually have a slide I can show you on that if you prefer.
What about artificial sources of concentration?
Well, I mean, not necessarily. I guess I'm not aware of any like robust strategy that's been employed where it's actually been evaluated and like a paper written on it. It's been more along the lines of density reductions.
Okay. But in those strategies are all part of the WAFR recommendations as well, right?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
But you know, I should be clear that when we're talking about artificial concentrations, it's not just going out there and proposing to reduce deer concentrations everywhere we see deer concentrated. It'd also be done in conjunction where we have data to suggest this is a hot spot. We need to address this. And so in that case, there has been some work done there.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Another thing just popped in my head. Are you comfortable with the state of where the state of science and research is to put a plan together like this and implement?
I guess it's, Commissioner Schmidt, I guess it's best summed up. I'm comfortable that we know enough to try some things. I'm not comfortable with telling the public that we unequivocally know these things are going to work, but we think they're worth trying, and we think we need to start trying these in some places sooner than later. I think in the absence of that, you can look at just the spread and the distribution of this disease across the state and the increasing prevalences that we're seeing in places like the project herd where we didn't even know CWD was really an issue. And all of a sudden now, granted, we haven't gotten to that 200 sample level yet, but you know, based on the samples we have where we have 57% prevalence, I mean, that's quite troubling. And so yeah, I think it's time to start embarking down that road.
Thanks.
Thank you, Justin.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think Brad's gonna.
Thanks, Justin. Well done as always. Commissioner President Dubey, Commissioners, I'd ask Brad Hovengate to come up now and give a brief presentation on our feed ground process that's related to this. So Brad.
President Dubey, members of the commission, Director Nesbitt, I am going to be brief. So I'm going to talk about a couple things real quick. I was given 5 minutes assigned for this. I'm going to try to keep it to 5. So I'm going to talk about, real quick, what the plan says about feed grounds in the current draft plan, and then talk a little bit about where we're going moving forward with our process to address feed ground issues. So just to begin, in the draft plan itself, it starts off and it talks a little bit about the history and background of elk feed grounds, and why we operate elk feed grounds, how we got there, and what we have them for. It goes into what we do on elk feed grounds as far as surveillance for disease, not only CWD, but brucellosis and other diseases that we do find on feed grounds. It goes into a little bit of explaining some of our techniques and current disease mitigation efforts that we conduct on feed grounds to try to limit disease transmission. And then also it has some information on our upcoming process, just describing why we're moving forward with the public process to address elk feed ground issues and why it's not more in depth in this plan itself. We decided early on that due to the complexities of feed grounds and feed ground management, that we felt that the feed ground issue warranted its own public engagement process, and we'll be moving forward with that. It also has some carryover guidance from the 2016 Chronic Wasting Disease Plan that is just good guidance and information that's in our the current 2016 plan that we felt was appropriate to carry over and guide us as we manage elk feed grounds until we finalize the feed ground disease management plan itself. So that's what's in the current plan. So as we went through this CWD feed ground or CWD working group process, there were some things we learned that were appropriate to moving forward. I just wanted to mention those real quick. Education is the key. Working with a group of people, both internally and externally in the department that have a high level of education about what you're talking about is the key to making good, appropriate decisions. And we found that in this case, and we're going to take that forward into our feed ground public engagement process too. And the other thing, when we started out talking about elk feed grounds, we felt like it was a localized process and we were treating it that way. And so we traveled the state and talked CWD through this process. We realized that feed grounds is much larger than a localized issue. It is a statewide issue, and there are people all over the state that have certainly care about how we manage elk feed grounds and elk populations in western Wyoming. So we have undertaken in our, we've undertaken to get started in a feed ground management public engagement process, and so far we've designed that to be a 3-phase process. The first phase is already underway. We've identified a steering committee that consists of a good mix of Pinedale regional folks, Jackson regional folks, and the CWD management team. And we've set a deadline to have phase 1 completed by the middle of January. So, and this will be a public education process where we help the public understand the complexity of elk feed grounds and all the issues that we deal with. So initially, we're in the process now of building those educational programs, and we'll essentially do a dry run with those in August with our own people internally. As same with CWD, we started out with an internal education program with our own folks, because even if you work for the game and fish, if you don't deal with it in your yard, sometimes we don't quite understand it. We found that with CWD, we find the same thing with feed grounds. So we'll look at starting out with an internal educational process and then move forward with, in November, December, 6 multi-agency educational processes. So we've reached out to our federal partners, Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, to be a part of this educational process with the public and help the public understand what their role in elk feed grounds are. We plan to have 6 of those workshops around the state, locally in Star Valley, Pinedale, and Jackson. Then we've also included Rock Springs, Cheyenne, and Casper. We'll have at least one of those recorded and posted on their website so everybody has access to that educational program. So even though there'll be an emphasis on CWD, this is going to encompass all feed ground issues that we deal with and all diseases. So it's pretty difficult to talk about how you manage for chronic wasting disease without talking about how you manage for brucellosis and the ways you do that. So this should be an all-encompassing sort of process that deals with not only CWD, but other diseases and other issues that we deal with in feed grounds from damage perspectives and maintaining elk population objectives. At each educational meeting, we'll focus on gathering questions, concerns, and ideas from the public, and then we're going to use this information that we get in these educational processes to kind of form what phase 2 looks like of the public engagement process. And we hope that we'll be able to acquire a outside facilitator to work with us on this and help us design that approach for phase 2. In phase 2, we'll identify the issues and find solutions, and that should begin in March of 2021. And we'll be looking at things as what did we learn from the public as in our educational meetings regarding phase 1. And analyze that and try to determine what's the best process for us to use to be successful in meeting the goals of this process. Is it a public collaborative process like this? Is it something that's designed a little different, that is more in the way of creating a management plan with public involvement and taking that to the public? How do other agencies play a role in this? And what are the possibilities of creating an advisory panel to advise the public involved in this collaborative process and the department? So a lot of things we'll use out of this phase 1 to determine how we move forward with phase 2. Then ultimately, phase 3 will be to draft a disease management feed ground plan that again will involve the public and public comment, and ultimately wind up here in front of the commission for you guys to approve. That's what I got, unless you have any questions on where we're going with the feed ground process.
Any questions, Brett?
Commissioner President Doobie, Commissioners Director Nesbitt, that's the department's presentation on the CWD measurement plan. We ask that you pass the plan as presented today so we can begin moving it forward.
Mr. President, we're going to discuss this a little bit, or first?
First of all, we're going to take 10 minutes.
All right.
I like that.
Commissioner President Dooley, Commissioner Director Nesbitt, I'd like to take a minute and just recognize the members of the working group that are here today. That again, as you heard many times, were a key component in the development of this plan. We have Garrett Falkenberg representing ag landowners, Bruce Lawson, sportsman, Cy Gillian, outfitter, Steve Martin, sportsman, Commissioner Schmidt, Game and Fish Commission, Tony Lehner, County Commissioner, Justin Caudale, Department of Ag, Martin Hicks, Game and Fish, Libby Langford, landowner, ag, and on Zoom we have Dr. Mary Wood, Millie Cooper, a public at large, Brant Shoemaker, our science representative, and Kent Conley, County Commissioner from Lincoln County. Again, thanks to those folks for their assistance in development of the plan. And those that aren't present today.
Thank you very much. Appreciate all their help and hard work. We're going to take public comment first before we decide what we're going to do and discuss that. I have a lot of blue sheets. It's been a long day. Please be short and concise and try not to filibuster. First one up, Jess Johnson.
I'm going to take the mask off for this one so I can actually see you guys. Commission President, Director Nesbitt, Commissioners Jesse Johnson, Wyoming Wildlife Federation. I'll keep it brief. We support this plan in a very big way. From what we know, the science indicates that action is likely the best option. Some of the actions that are likely to help, like careful carcass disposal, are easy to agree on, but others, like reducing herd sizes, especially older age males, are a hard pill to swallow for our hunting culture. Dealing with CWD puts us in a position of deciding whether we want to continue to manage for the wants of today's hunters or the needs of our herds and the needs of hunters further down the line. So we are talking about the generations within the womb of time. As a hunter, I am willing to take a risk and look at this and try and make this work, because further down the line, I would like my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, my great-great-grandchildren to also hunt in these places that I get to now and see the deer that I get to now. It is uncomfortable to consider, but to even attempt to manage CWD at this point, it requires a shift in our perspective from being hunters who want to maximize the hunting experience to being stewards of our deer herds and doing what is best for the long-term health of the herd and the future of hunting in Wyoming. We very much support this CWD plan. We applaud the hard work. It is incredible that a group of nearly 30 people came to consensus. That is amazing. That just demonstrates just a very broad, hardworking stakeholder that went out and came to a consensus. So thank you guys. Thank you for hearing this. This was an incredible presentation. We applaud the work of the CWD group and we firmly, firmly support this plan.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Next up on Zoom, is this Zoom? Jared Oakley.
Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can, Jared.
Fantastic. President Doobie, commissioners, director, thanks for providing this opportunity to comment today. I really appreciate it. And again, thank you to the working group that worked so hard to produce this plan. It's interesting. I think I'm here today representing backcountry hunters and anglers of Wyoming. Some of you may also know me with work with Muley Fanatics as well. You know, it seems like there's some ways to be unpopular in Wyoming. Some of the easy ones to suss out are if you root for CSU during border wars. That's a good way to be unpopular. Going to a crowd of people and saying, so who is this Chris Ledoux chap anyway? That can get you a bit ostracized. And the one that has come up here recently that I don't fully understand is proposing allowing hunters to kill more deer for the betterment of deer. And that kind of misses the mark of the North American conservation model. And I want to tell a story from an event that we have at BHA here in Wyoming called Hunting for Sustainability. Hunting for Sustainability, we bring out college-age folks who haven't ever hunted before, haven't been exposed to it, and they learn about the North American conservation model. They learn that hunting can be good for wildlife under the North American conservation model, and they learn how to process animals and provide CWD samples. So we're hosting that, and one of the students was particularly interesting to me because he was a PhD in the University of Wyoming, an exchange student from India. And he was studying compassion. And so, and being a vegan, he also, it was very interesting to watch him as he went through that weekend of learning about things. And at the end of that course, he stood up and he said, I came here as a PhD studying compassion, and I came here to learn about what I thought was evil. And what I learned is that hunting is compassionate. And he totally understood why we hunt wildlife and why we hunt wildlife under the North American conservation model. And that's because it's the right thing to do to manage the long-term sustainability of the herd. And we think that this plan hits that tone perfectly and resonates with the North American conservation model, of which our chapter, this commission, and the Wyoming Game and Fish embraces as the tool to managing wildlife. So specifically, we support the CWD plan, and we want to put extra emphasis on a few items. We applaud the use and proposed experimentation with public hunting as a tool to slow the spread and reduce prevalence. Of note, we believe the public process for identifying these test areas is essential, but also prevalence thresholds and research design criteria must be accounted for to ensure efficacy. We appreciate the extra emphasis the department has placed on collaborating with the working group, as well as future collaborations that are inherently baked into this plan that we learned so much about in the presentations that have occurred. And finally, we want to make sure that science guides the recommendations put forth to effectively respond to the needs of wildlife impacted by CWD. And we recognize that several measures in this plan integrate scientific rigor, as well as we take note that this plan recommends future ways to integrate science into this response. So in closing, the North American model was founded by visionaries who sacrificed their short-term hunting opportunities for the betterment of future hunting and wildlife. And I really believe that we're at that same turning point with chronic wasting disease. So with that, BHA Wyoming supports this approach and commits its assistance to ensure the future of hunting and wildlife in Wyoming. Thank you.
Thank you, Jared. Next up, we have Bruce Lawson.
President Dooley, members of the commission, Director Nesbitt, thank you for your time today. Thank you for allowing me to comment. My name is Bruce Lawson. I'm a Kestrel, Wyoming native. I'm also a member of the Chronic Wasting Disease Working Group. I'd like to thank you, Brian, for allowing me to participate on that. It's been a great honor. Thank you. I'm here today to urge you to support the plan that the Game and Fish Department has developed based on the hard work that our group has performed. A lot has gone into it, a lot of time, a lot of effort. I'm sure a lot of you have been involved in working groups, and they're not easy, especially a working group as large as ours. But we have a lot of brilliant minds from people all over the state in various capacities and very knowledgeable in what they do. I really want to commend Mary Wood, Hank Edwards, and Justin Dimfit for the plan that they have drawn up. Given the current plan that we have, it's imperative that we approve this revised plan and move forward. When you look at some of the data that was presented today, particularly some of that data that Hank showed on the rate of prevalence from the 2019 sampling, you know, we've got incredible double-digit numbers of prevalence in mule deer and whitetail deer. I think WAFA recommends that management actions be taken at 5%, but pretty amazing. Also, some of the slides that Justin presented, which shows the march of chronic wasting disease across the state. It's time that we adopt this plan and at least give the department a toolbox to, you know, truly, it's not a perfect plan, no plan is, but I think what we have is worthwhile, and we need to, you know, give some of these managers like Martin Hicks back there some tools to work with to at least experiment a little bit and see what options work and what options don't. The current plan is just inadequate. So again, I think time is the essence. I think the coronavirus is a great example of what an uncontrolled disease does to a population when you have no cure, no plan in place to combat the disease. So again, thank you for your time, and I urge you to please approve this plan. Thank you.
Steve Martin.
Afternoon, President Doobie, Commissioners, Director Nesbitt. I just want to echo some of the same things that you have heard or will hear about this, the working group and the hard work that was put in. I do want to thank Director Nesbitt for allowing me to be a part of that, and you know, appreciate all the hard work that everybody that was on that working group put into it. And we feel we have a workable plan, at least something to go forward with, and want to support that. And take any questions if you have. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. Zachary Key?
Mr. Doobie, Brian, commissioners. I feel like the Debbie Downer of the group, and I'm going to apologize out of the gate for that. But I drove a little ways here to at least share my thoughts and opinion on the situation at hand. I first off want to commend everybody that was part of this process. I manage a company. I'm a town council member, also a board member on the Muley Fanatics, so I understand the effort put into these processes. And this is not a personal attack on any individual or the process taken in hand. I want to be clear that I'm an ally of the game and fish and make that clear. It's not lost in my comments today. So I participated in the general public meeting in December in Pinedale, and there were some concerns brought up there, which were all covered today as far as some potential culling of some herds, things like that, that obviously bring concern to me. And I asked, and I guess I've gotten a little clarity today. So it's one of the deals you come here prepared with a certain set of things to talk about, and then you get a little bit of clarity on top of that. Some of the things that were discussed today were a little bit different than discussed at the December 2nd meeting. So, but what I have is I say, you know, do not approve this management plan yet. And I want to make sure it's clear on the keyword yet. I'm all about a plan. We need to put a plan in place. I'm all about trying to get in front of this and not be, not be too late. But I just don't feel like, for me, I don't feel like we're there yet. And I know I'm speaking for a lot of representatives out of the Southwest area of Wyoming that have wrote in letters of concern and everything else as well. So I'm here representing multiple people with some of these thoughts. So I've done several months worth of research, and regarding since that December 2nd meeting, I'm trying to find some solid evidence of a CWD leader, and I really haven't, found that solid evidence. And I think we talked about that a little bit in here today. So my proposal is a different thought process, and I say keep this as a draft plan and use this as our game and fish's resume to move forward with these outfits, because let's be realistic here. Funding is always one of the main problems with any of these projects, trying to get in front of things, get the research done. So I say keep this as our working draft resume, so to speak. Let's go out to the Wildlife Fund, Muley Fanatics, federal level. Let us derive funds any way possible to come up with some real viable solutions. The topic should be, we're trying to finalize our CWD management plan with some real leading solutions, but we need help getting there. That's where my head is on this. And I'm going to be honest with you guys, and this is a comment that's a little bit blunt. We need to figure out how to neutralize the prions in the soil. Otherwise, what are we talking about? I don't even understand what we're talking about in this whole entire CWD management plan. We go out and shoot, let's just pretend we go out and hunt or harvest 200 deer in a high prevalence area. It's 13 to 17 years in the soil. How do we get in front of that? That's the biggest struggle I have. And I know you guys don't know the answer. I don't know the answer. I'm one of those guys that likes to bring solutions to the table, I promise you. But that is the biggest struggle for me, is how are we ever going to get in front of this? We're going to go out and kill deer that we don't have in hopes to get in front of it when it's laying in the soil for 13 years. I can't wrap my head around what we're actually doing besides killing 200 deer to try something. And I say a couple of goofy things. You guys will probably snicker, think I'm a crazy man. But let's figure out a quick field test. Let's derive funds to increase the lab testing abilities, which I learned today is apparently not an issue, as it was kind of identified in December 2nd. Can we design a safe crop dusting agent that neutralizes the prions in the grasses in the high prevalence areas? A powder that can be sprinkled by water holes and mineral sites, spread at feed grounds. I just feel like we've got to figure out, spend some energy on how to get in front of that 13, 17-year prion in the soil, and not be so focused on culling a whole bunch of deer in hopes that we actually achieve something. So the moral of my story is we can't move forward until we have some real solutions, in my opinion. And just trying something because is confusing activity and progress. I'm the co-chairman of Upper Green Muley Fanatic Board in Southwest Wyoming. I'm not here representing them today, but I want to bring it to my next point. We spend countless volunteer hours trying to figure out how to improve these mule deer and even elk herds in our area. We do all sorts of projects, such as large and small habitat projects. We help fund Monteith's ongoing studies, and we've gotten the luxury of participating in a lot of his projects and studies on the ground. We wrote a check for $24,000 to Wildlife Fund the Dry Piney project last year, and we're doing another check this year for $20K. Our main goal is to try to figure out how to build these big herds up, and that's why the Dry Piney project, to me, was important because it provides immediate wildlife saving results for these mule deer. We also sponsor several game and fish projects, helped purchase a very high dollar mower this year, all sorts of projects, many of those projects. So I feel like we're vested, I feel like we care, and that's why I mentioned earlier that I'm definitely an ally. But I also feel like it's counterintuitive to be building habitat, removing highway construction, and then go out and cull some mule deer and elk in the hopes to slow down CWD when it's not working in other states as well as they had hoped. I have a little 5-second deal about the feed grounds, and everybody may have a different view on the feed grounds than me as well, but I get that these other states are not happy with us. The Forest Service is recently not happy with us. And number one, tell Montana to clean up their own house before they worry about our house. They have game farms that carry more CWD than the whole state of Wyoming. Number two, we need to be feeding more than ever. We're building homes, commercial properties, highways, airports, and many other man-made things at a fast rate. As we encroach these big game's habitats, winter range is lost shrub, and big games are going to naturally herd up, still having CWD communication. I also view this differently than most. Wouldn't you want to put in more feed grounds, more water holes, more mineral slides? I would think keeping those herds healthy, spread out, would be a better idea than, for example, taking 20 water holes away and forcing them to use one water hole in an area to where now they're forced to centralize. So I just mentioned that for a different thought process. I feel like it would be better to expand them out among the range as best we can. Why did I mention the feed grounds? That's the important question. I feel like if we put the CWD management plan into writing, and I know we already have a plan that's established in the past, but we put this into writing, and our anti-hunters or anti-feed groups, in my opinion, are going to come after the game and fish. They're going to demand you to shut down the feed grounds, and this is now going to be their tool. Leave it as a draft, keep working, get the public involved, try some of these processes, but keep it in a draft form to where it can't be used as a legal tool later in the plan. In closing, I received an email from one of the commissioners, Mr. Doobie, stating this plan will be a tool to combat CWD, and all items on the plan will be approved through meetings in public settings. Let's be honest with each other. I typically attend 80% of the game and fish meetings, and half the time I'm alone. So my fear is I can't stand alone, and a lot of people don't ever show up. I mean, if you take the population of Wyoming right now, we're 580,000 people, and there's maybe 20 people in here. So if you do a quick math equation, there's just not a lot of people that participate. This plan will be used against game and fish to eliminate feed grounds and wildlife, and they will find an attorney with enough juice to shove it down the game and fish department's throat, and this will be their legal document to support the lawsuit. And then I got to mention one last struggle that's in front of my team. It's hard for me to go raise hundreds of thousands of dollars per year with the Muley Fanatics. And I'm able to do that because these people trust me. They trust that I'm going to do the right thing with their money, and this is their hard-earned money. And it's hard for me to raise that money, tell them I'm passionate about the Dry Piney project, passionate about healing up deer numbers, we're donating thousands yearly to the game and fish projects, and then tell them the same sentence, the game and fish is going to hand out several hundred tags in multiple areas to cull the herds to establish CWD prevalence or in hopes to rid CWD in that area without tackling the prion issue. The general public will call BS on muley fanatics. They'll call BS on the Game and Fish Department. Don't let this plan be an action to check off a list just to say it's been completed. Keep working the plan, find the solution at the end of the ideas, and let's lead by example because that's the core values of the Wyoming Game and Fish. I'd like to thank everybody in the room today and hope everyone has safe travels home.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you very much. Libby Langford.
Good afternoon, President Doobie, Brian Nesbitt, and members of the commission. My name is Libby Langford Pennington, and I'm a rancher from Southeast Wyoming. I wrote down my statement because I didn't know if I was going to have to work or not. So I'm just going to read this. I'm a rancher in Southeast Wyoming. My ranch borders the Sheep Mountain Forest area, which I'm sure that you are all aware of, that is going through the Sheep Mountain Initiative, where they are making a larger and better habitat for mule deer population. I'm a huge supporter of this, and I'm also an advocate for the CWD management plan. I've watched deer populations decrease over the years, and I'm a hunter, and I allow people to hunt on our ranch. It has become difficult for deer hunters over the past 15 years to harvest deer. This plan is a great start to bring CWD to the forefront and attention of the public. Director Nesbitt called us to action in our first meeting. This plan can be tailored to individual herd units and hunt areas. It is an option. It is a start, which is what exactly we need. And this plan is publicly driven. We had 2 public meetings, as well as all of us as stakeholders, that made sure that the public was heard. Wyomingites did not want us to just sit back and do nothing. It's based on us learning from scientists from Wisconsin, Colorado, and the WAPA recommendation. It has a communication and education part to it that many of the working group members want to help with, and we obviously need. This plan is majorly accepted. Out of 54 recommendations, 40 passed with consensus. Many of us said as a group, we should meet up again in 3 to 5 years to get updated and to continue our work. We are invested. We do not want to see our wildlife just die. We had to do something. This, in fact, has sparked a study to address artificial concentration and CWD prevalence. In addition, you cannot just kill the prions in the soil. It is outlined in the plan and gone over and beaten like a dead horse in environmental factors. Not much kills it. Not fire, not bleach, and you can't spray bleach on a great big area. You can't replace the soil either. Colorado tried to in their captive facilities and failed. This process has been run flawlessly by Jessica Western in the House School. 31 of us were chosen, and we are extremely diverse. We have politicians, community members, hunters, scientists, vets, DEA, WIDOT, and agriculturalists. We attended the first public comment meetings. Suggestions were written down by everyone there. Jessica then compiled them into spreadsheets and put into different categories. Even the most ludicrous and controversial topics were discussed in our meetings and made into recommendations. All of the recommendations are based off of science and public comment. Outside of the working group meetings and public meetings, we all talked to our constituents, and one member even took it above and beyond to make sure that meat processors were known and wanted to make sure that one of our recommendations would work for them. We got the absolute most relevant, current, past, and projected CWD data there was. We had experts from other states, including Dr. Miller from Colorado, who has dedicated his career to CWD research. They gave us their opinions and support on this controversial public process. We then tested for consensus on all the recommendations. We discussed at length the repercussions, the worry, and the doubt that we all had. And there was a lot. We also had a lot of support, including that of Representative Cheney and Senator Barrasso. The plan was released and the public had the time to comment again on the plan itself. We then again tested for consensus and agreed that this was needed as our starting point. We as Wyomingites need to remember our love for hunting, fishing, and that we are all conservationists. We also aren't scared to ruffle some feathers. Please don't forget our working group took the public viewpoints into major consideration. There was a year for people to comment on our recommendation and to make recommendations for our working group. But for me, this plan is more than just that. It's for our children and their children's children. We all worked hard so that future generations, like my son Owen, can experience buck fever and baby deer in our hay meadow, so that we all can enjoy going into our forests and open spaces and harvesting our wildlife. Please take this plan into consideration, as it is our starting point for our wildlife population to continue to be a staple of Wyoming life. This is our call to action to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Louis. Sean? I'm gonna butcher that. There you go. You got it right.
President Doobie, Director Nesbitt, members of the commission. I'm Sean Blazek with the Mule Deer Foundation, and we'd like to wholeheartedly support this. And we appreciate all the hard work of both the department and the working group. And we understand this has got to be an adaptive plan, and a lot of the science isn't there yet. And we understand that some of the stuff, you know, the local guys are going to try may not show any results for years. But I think it's about time we try something in Wyoming. We do have enough science to start, and with the local knowledge and the talent we have within the state, within the game and fish, I think they'll make good educated choices on which of these strategies they'll use to try to, you know, mitigate some of the spread of CWD and the, you know, abundance of it. So we overall support it, with, you know, hope the commission passes this and moves forward with it. That's basically it. I don't want to take up any more of your time. It's going to be a lot of the same as the other groups have said.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Arden Hicks?
President Doobie, members of the commission, appreciate you guys taking the time to listen to us today. And I really appreciate my tenure with the fish, a wonderful ride, and I appreciate your forethought on passing us with the plan. Myself and another game and fish employee were on the steering committee, charged with coming up with recommendations. I just heard this one. And at first I wasn't sure what my role was on that committee, wearing the red shirt or my Joe citizens. So it took a while. Dr. Weston did an incredible job of pushing us through that process, looking at every angle that was presented to us, and trusted us to come up with a recommendation to get that. I just want to applaud the rest of our steering committee members, applaud Jessica, Justin, Hank, Mary, thank you guys very much. Janet, thank you for putting us on task. And this is a plan that folks like myself, the local agency, can go back to the local communities and it's a start. As Justin mentioned, I've worked in Cleveland for the last 18 years. I've watched this needs, watched what it's done for our herds, and we need to do something. And this is something. So thank you guys very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Dr. Dick Edwards.
I'm Dr. Dick Edwards. Thank you. Thanks for the time, ladies and gentlemen of the commission and director. Is there anybody in this room that take a bullet for mule deer? Is there anybody gonna stand in harm's way for mule deer? Which one? Or all the mule deer in the state of Wyoming? Is there anybody in here take a bullet for the mule deer population in Wyoming? I've been asked to take a bullet for a lot less important things. I don't see anybody with their hand up. No, we're the real men. You're not going to take a bullet for all the mule deer in Wyoming? This is all about money. Who's going to fund this? You're going through cuts. The state of Wyoming is $1 billion in debt. You're going to, who knows where this crazy thing is going to end up, but it's about money. Where are you going to fund it? Nobody's talked about the economic impact of the CWD program on the state of Wyoming. What's the long-term effect? Because it's gonna hurt meat processors, because people aren't gonna process this meat. People aren't gonna come to Wyoming. Your website page you talked about so much, CWD's plastered all over it. You're gonna charge somebody $400 for a deer license to come to Wyoming and shoot diseased deer? You're making the problem worse. Wyoming avoided this for a long time. I've been at it. I've been impacted by it more than anybody maybe in this country. I've been depopulated twice. Cost me millions of dollars in the game ranch I own in Nebraska. It's empty now. I'm running cattle. So I've had it right in teeth. And I worked with ARS, Animal Research Services, on a federal level for 5 years. I poured an intensive mineral program to these deer and elk in a controlled environment, poured the chelated copper, the chelated zinc, and manganese, and I stopped the death because they were mine. It affected me personally. It was my living. It works. It works. It's just like these viruses right now. We've got the blue tongue and those forms of EHD. I don't know which ones. I can't tell them apart. I'm not a scientist. But they're raging over in our part of the country. They roared through the state of Wyoming in 2012. They're back. Another drought. This drought is going to have a huge impact. I don't care what all your plans are on population and proposed population and what the hell all is going to go on, but this drought is going to wreck everything you're thinking about and putting together. Not just the drought and the farms it'll kill, because there's parts of that country up there, there's miles and miles of water. It's serious. Those animals are all going to die. They don't know how to move to a fresh water source. So we've got a huge problem on our hands. This could set all your wildlife management and all your meetings and all this stuff back 10 years. And it's going to happen in whitetails, mule deer, and antelope. And these viruses that roar through can kill 90% of the deer. I've seen it. The last one on 150,000 acres north of Luck, 3 or 4 big ranches, we flew it. You could count the live mule deer on one hand. That's not serious. They come back slowly. They may never be back. So this deal is, if money is driven the CWD research, that's what always drives research, is money. There's no money, it doesn't happen. So they've kicked the can down the road and kicked the can down the road because they won't, you can't find, if it's not a disease, you can't get any funding, you can't get any grants. So this is continually moved along. That's why we've been 30 years. Prions can stand an autoclave. That's the sanitation of surgical instruments. You can't kill it. It's in the ground. It was in the ground on my ranch because we had 200 head of mule deer in there. Half of them tested positive. They tested from 6 months old, which had never happened before, to 10 and a half years old. And all of these deer were in there long enough that they were all born and raised in there. It's in the ground. We killed all them out. We filled it with 50 head of elk, fed them a high mineral content feed. And we cut our losses down to single digit. 1 out of 50. We'd randomly harvest elk as we went along until we ran out. We only had 1 test positive. So there's a lot of things that could be done. This thing's all blown out of proportion. I And I'm here for the honesty and the truth. The truth is this thing is about money. And it's not, in politics, it's not about real stuff. If your people have been raised in ranch management and raised by a drill sergeant like I was, it has some common sense and practical application. You can't stop this disease by killing mature bucks. The key to this whole thing is immune system. Why do elk, are they less susceptible? Well, elk don't get blue tongue or EHD. They don't die from it. Now you'll have midterm abortion. They will abort midterm. The cows will. If they get it bad enough. It doesn't kill a cow. Blue tongue affects livestock, affects cattle the same way. If you got a dry year like this, and blue tongue rages through your cattle herd, you're going to ship a bunch of dries in the fall because they will abort midterm. But nobody, the ag department doesn't want to talk about it because it gets people upset. This is all real. I've lived it. I didn't get a degree by making stuff up, and I didn't get paid every month the same. All this has affected me directly. That's why I'm here. And I'm putting up with it. I'm not going to wait. I'm retired and I have money now. You're going to see me all the time.
Did you live in Wyoming?
Yes, sir.
Where
I was born and raised. I was born and raised in Douglas Natural Bridge Ranch. I've had some ground in Lusk and I own some ground in Bi-State. I own some ground over in Nebraska. I'm too old to take hunters, the big game hunters anymore, so now we're hunting pheasants. I can carry a bunch of them. I can clean a whole passel of them. A hell of a lot easier than I can clean an elk. And I can't carry them out on my back. My knees are completely shot of taking backpack sheep hunters and carrying 130 pounds out because I wasn't going to make 2 trips and I was too dumb, stupid young to know the difference. Now my knees are gone. Anyway.
Well, I appreciate it.
Well, I'm telling it like it is, straight up. This is the truth. And that's what I look for in everything, the truth.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. Next up, we have Tony Lane. Tony around? There he is.
Thank you, Tony. Commissioners, thank you for giving me this opportunity very quickly. I'd like to thank all of you for giving me the chance to be on this working group. I strongly support what we've come up with in this plan. I think it's a positive one. One of the things that I felt was most important is through this whole process, we developed a lot of relationships. And I think most of you and just probably everyone realizes how important relationships are. And I think what we have accomplished with this is by taking those relationships and coming up with some of these ideas, then we put a lot of trust into our game and fish. And I really believe that they will handle this plan with dignity and with respect to all the hard work that everybody has done. I don't think we're going to go off half-cocked and make any kind of decision not based on science, not based on careful consideration to the general public and positive influence by all of those involved before any of these tools that we've developed will come to pass. So again, I strongly support this. As a county commissioner in Converse County and a rancher in Converse County as well, you know, I've seen the effects of CWD, and I think this will give us an opportunity to maybe address a lot of these issues. You're certainly not going to solve the problem in a short time period, but we can get started and maybe arrest the problem to some extent by using these tools we presented. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Scott Kurtz.
Thank you for the opportunity to address the commission, and I want to thank the committee that put all this stuff together. It does take a lot of hard work and a lot of time that you essentially donate, which is a part of the patriotism of Wyoming, I guess. I'm from Saratoga. I've been immersed in agriculture, conservation, and wildlife for most of my life, I guess. There's a few flaws in this plan that I'd like to point out. involvement in agriculture, particularly scrapie and sheep, closely parallels what happens in BSE and in mule deer. In fact, the sheep were blamed for the jump from sheep to cervids at CSU when they had captive sheep and deer next to each other. And that happened 60 years ago or so. But the consequences of scrapie and sheep is that they've determined that there's resistant genetics, and by blood test you can determine whether the DNA is resistant or not, and the animals will never have it. I'm concerned with the kill potential in these plans, that you're going to be killing survivors, and in the biological business you need to propagate the survivors. See the same thing in bighorn sheep, where they go in California and you have some exposure to pneumonia. They show up, decide they've been exposed to the biological agent, and the public perception is, well, you need to get rid of the ones that are left. Well, that's exactly the wrong tactic to use. You're killing the survivors, and that's my concern with this plan. Is guy with the gun has no idea whether he's shooting something that's resistant. They're going to find resistance in here somewhere. It's going to be tougher to find it in sheep, but that's been known in sheep and scrapie for almost 20 years now. And they used to come in and condemn a whole flock of sheep if you had a trace back. Now they come in and blood type, determine the resistant genetics, and just take the ones that won't survive. It's pretty much Darwinism. You got to propagate the survivors to stay in this business. It's a big business in Wyoming, and there's some other things that you could do to modify the effect of this thing. But I think the flaws in this plan should be left in draft. I agree with the fellow that said it should be left in draft, because to just go in and call without knowing what you're calling is probably not a good thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I have Brant Schumacher. Brant?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, Brant. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. President Doobie, Commissioners, Director Nesbitt. I want to thank you for the opportunity to comment on this important issue. My name is Brant Schumacher. I'm an associate professor in the UW Department of Veterinary Sciences, veterinary epidemiologist at the Wyoming State Vet Lab, and the scientific representative on the CWD working group. I want to speak in support of this plan and urge you to vote in favor of it. I want to emphasize that this is a plan that was not done in haste. In fact, this is a plan 35 years in the making and represents a year of dedicated work by a large, inclusive process and a large group of varied stakeholders. Many of the issues raised today we considered and wrestled with, as well as all other concerns raised by the public. The important thing to note is that this is an adaptive management plan. Is it perfect? No. But please don't allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good. As an adaptive management plan, it'll allow for new tests and tools to be employed as they come online. And in the meantime, it'll give our biologists options to deploy at a local level so that we can continue to learn and hopefully fight back the spread of this disease. In medicine, we have a saying: internists know everything but do nothing. Surgeons know nothing but do everything. And pathologists know everything, do everything, but it's too late for the patient. If we wait until we have all the answers, my sincere fear is that we're going to have to be pathologists, knowing everything we should have done, but being too late to conserve the animals we care about. So once again, I just ask you to please support this plan. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Any more on Zoom? Any more blue sheets? Mr. Kennedy? No? What's the pleasure of the commission?
Mr. Doobie, I'm prepared to motion.
Fair enough.
So I would move that we approve the plan as written.
There's a motion, is there a second?
I will second.
Okay, it's moved by Commissioner Frank, seconded by Commissioner Ryle.
Discussion, Mr. President.
Yes.
So first off, thank you for the group that put this plan together. Particularly the citizen component who paid their own money to attend meetings and did all this hard work on behalf of the people of Wyoming and wildlife. So huge thank you. CWD, so 5 years ago, I joined the commission and I found out that we had agreed to just keep coal for the nation. We would take the management action. I'm not imputing anybody to reach that decision, but we would take the management actions, we would do some testing, and people would just look to us as the state where no one did anything, and then compare us to states where they took action. And I found that absolutely unacceptable. So I begged, pleaded, cajoled, threatened, tried to try to get the department to look at management plans and possibly taking action. It was just, and so CWD is incredibly scary to me as a sportsman and as a citizen. I mean, it's fatal. There is no silver bullet. It's spreading wildly across the state. If they're setting out now, start looking at this, let's say we don't do anything, it will affect the population levels of certain herds such that we may not be able to hunt them, and certainly won't be able to hunt them in the numbers that we currently do. And I think the scary thing about it is it's unsolvable. I mean, we've heard a lot of comments today that it uptakes into the grass. And as President Saul said, the water holes and so how do you take care of that? Even if we had a chemical that we could spray to kill the prions, everyone said. How do we spray millions of acres of wildlife habitat? There's no vaccine. So I understand how scary this is. I understand how threatening this is to our wildlife. I understand how threatening it is to our wildlife herds. And there's no cure. And that's sad. And the reason I hope some really bright young man or lady comes up with a cure. But to do nothing and act like an ostrich and stick our head in the sand was unacceptable. When I discovered the department had done that, it's unacceptable to me today. So I also want to applaud the courage of the working group to actually put into this plan what those who, for whatever reason, want to attack the plan are using. It took real courage for this group to say maybe any management option is to kill adult nuclear on the range because we have a higher prevalence. Maybe we should think about doing that. That's courage. It would have been so easy just to not put that in the plan. We wouldn't have all this passion and energy today, but that passion and energy is a good thing. Part of what the department embarked on was to educate the public in Wyoming about CWD, its causes, its effect, the incredible threat it poses to our wildlife, and to allow people to make informed decisions at a basic level. Do you want to eat a deer that tests positive for CWD? That's an important component of this process and an important component of the plan. So let me just address this whole idea about killing large nuclear. Nowhere in this plan does it say we issue an extra 200 licenses for the Wyoming. It says this is an adaptive management plan, which means we're going to figure out what potential management actions we might take as we go along and look at the hurdles
you know, that there's, I would say it's not appropriate to challenge this plan based on that one idea that appears in the plan that we're going to somehow pull deer, which needs to be getting fish going out and blasting 200 deer. That's not going to occur with this commissioner as long as I'm on the commission. And it's unfair to challenge this plan and try to force this plan to be adopted based on this material that we're harvest. So as I read the plan, it specifically says experimental hunter harvest strategies that focus on significant reductions in male deer and or overall hits will only be implemented in areas where broad and diverse public support exists. So based on the hundreds of comments I read, there is nowhere I see in Wyoming where broad and diverse public support exists for going out and harvesting the bunch of material here, particularly the wells that some people are throwing out there that issue another 200 licenses. So it can't occur today. But that's just the first hurdle. These strategies will not be proposed on a large scale, i.e. within numerous surveys or actions across large geographic areas in the absence of peer-reviewed public research indicating there are viable means to reduce CWD over the long term. That doesn't exist as far as I know today. So that's yet another hurdle to whacking 200 million in one year. And then the third hurdle is it takes commission action. Anything like that would require the department to come in front of the commission in our April season setting, where this commission voted to whack 200 deer in Wyoming. That's not going to occur in the near future. And then the whole idea of this was first proposed by Hank Edwards and Dr. Mary Wood as a possible management action was that if you're going to do this, you really have to study the effect of harvesting large mature mule deer out of an isolated herd unit. Not a migratory herd unit, but a very isolated herd unit where there's very little genetic interchange from that herd. And you have to study it for 10 to 15 years to show whether that actually statistically reduced prevalence or whether it could totally get rid of CWD in the herd or what effect that management action had. So the fourth hurdle that will have to occur before that ever happens is this commission will have to spend $2 or $3 million probably, I would estimate, to commit to doing something that right now is horribly unpopular with the public and studying it for 10 or 15 years. So there are four huge hurdles with regard to the roadblocks that people are throwing up against this plan that I just don't think will occur. But I'm incredibly pleased, and I'm honored that I had some tiny little part of the hard work that ultimately occurred to broadly and robustly solicit public comment and internal comment from the department. I hired Jessica Weston to make sure that this was a fair and rational process on a very volatile, passionate issue. I'm glad that this committee thought outside the box and said, what can we possibly do? And I'm glad that you had the courage to put this recommendation that maybe harvesting mature mule deer might be an option sometime in the future. And I'm glad that the education you've done to educate the people of Wyoming, and particularly the sportsmen of Wyoming, with regard to CWD. It would be a horrible mistake not to adopt this plan or to pull a tool out of the toolbox today. This plan is like a menu. And so right now, in the future commissions and future sportsmen and future publics and future departments can pick whether they want a hamburger, a steak, or a Cobb salad. It makes no sense to me to say you can't have a hamburger if that's what's appropriate to deal with the situation that's on the ground, in 2024, 2025, or 2030, after this commission's long gone. I mean, it's a possible management tool that could be selected if you clear those 4 hurdles. I think this is a great plan, and I urge my fellow commissioners to vote to approve this plan. Commissioner Grant.
Mr. President, let me just make a comment. I mean, I think that we do need to look at this and do something. But I think we have some other good ideas with the mineral program. Trying to find a way to get rid of the premium that maybe we could look at in the future too. I don't know. I would go with the culling as the last resort. That's just my opinion.
Thank you.
Mr. President. I was fortunate enough to be selected by Brian to sit on the CWD working group, and I appreciate the honor to be on that group. Probably the best memories I have of being on that group is when we first started, the first meeting, and Brian gave us a video introduction, and he threw out a challenge to us. He said, look, we need to be thinking outside the box. And I thought, this is good. This is going to be good. We're gonna get somewhere with this plan. We're going to really do something different and try to make a difference with the CWD issue. We had multiple presentations and thoughts by the experts from regionally. What I found fascinating when the experts were talking is, as I was listening to the group ask questions, the vast majority of the answers were the questions were, we don't know, we're not sure yet, we need to do more research. So then my mind goes to, how are we going to build some type of a management plan when the experts don't even have any answers? How do we do that? And that's when I started really paying attention to what all of the management strategies and stuff that were brought forth to the group. I mean, personally, I think the plan is full of holes. I could take every one of these things and pick it apart to where I don't think it's going to move the needle at all when it comes to dealing with the CWD issue we have in the state. And a lot of these are a 10 to 15-year process. A lot of the strategies that we've got in place have been tried. And I mean, it says it right in the plan from Alberta, from Colorado. They don't use the words like this worked, this was successful. They use words like this can or could or might or may help. That's what it was. There's no solid yes. Those are from the other states and provinces that have tried these very things we're talking about. We're basically following the WAFA recommendation. And in my simple mind, I'm sitting here thinking, and I've thought all along through this process, we've got 21 states or so that are involved with WAFA, 4 provinces. Does it really make sense for 21 states and 4 provinces to do the same damn thing with CWD? And watch it for 15 years, and at 15 years, guess what? We've got 21 states and 4 provinces that have the same answers. I don't understand that logic. I think Wyoming is better than that. I think we need to challenge ourselves. We talk about our biologists and our people all the time, how great they are and how good they are, and I believe that. I've been out there with them. I've watched them. I've watched passion and dedication. And it saddens me to think that we're going to follow the same footsteps as everybody else, that we don't put more into this plan than that. We need to find some answers. That's what we need to do. You know, we talk about the hunter survey. We put out 3,500 survey, 3,500 resident, non-resident hunters. We got 1,201 responses back. That's about a third. Out of the third, we got about about 900 of them that actually said we need to do something with CWD. We issue 155,000 elk, deer, and moose tags in the state every year, minimum. We have probably 2 times or maybe 3 times that many applicants. We're going to do something on 900 people to this magnitude. I look at that survey as completely backwards. I look at it as we had no success with that survey. We had no real input, because what it tells me is the majority of the people, they don't care. It's not an issue for them. I'm not saying that we don't address CWP. We have to address it somehow. We have to look at it. I'm not trying to be obstinate. I'm not trying to degrade the plan. I know the hard work that this committee put into it. I know what it was done. I was there. I witnessed it. I was part of it. There was a lot of thought and a lot of passion involved in this. But I think we're better than this. I don't think it meets the challenge that Director Nesbitt threw down. I'm worried about the public opinion process like Mr. Key brought up. I've been to these public meetings. I try to go to as many as I can. Nobody shows up. What kind of public process, what kind of public opinion are we going to have if nobody's there? I understand we got to have broad public opinion. We got to have commission approval to do that, to make any kind of forward movement with this plan. But we're not going to be here forever. You know, Pat and David are gone here next spring. You, me, and Galen are gone in 3 years. Half of our term is over already. I don't know what kind of commissioners we're going to get. Maybe we shouldn't worry about that, but I think we should. I mean, I look in here that it takes broad public opinion, it takes commission approval, but in the back of this plan, and it says that very thing in this plan, that it takes broad public opinion and commission approval to move forward with any of these strategies. But it also says in here multiple times, and I've highlighted every one, that the Game and Fish will do this. It doesn't say the Game and Fish might. It doesn't say the Game and Fish may. It doesn't say the Game and Fish could. It says they will do this. And if we make this document, if we approve this and put this document in writing, it becomes our document, our plan. Someone, somewhere is going to find that and they're going to say, you better do this because you said you would. That's my greatest fear. That this is going to come back and bite us at some point. We're better than this, people. This department's better than this. We've got the finest out. We need to get involved in the CWD and find some answers. I urge my fellow commissioners to really put some thought into this before we approve it. Think about what this means long term. Thank you.
Mr. President, 14, 15 years ago, I went through a game and fish stop over where they take the test, they take the lymph node. I didn't know what CWD was. Pat and I have been on the commission for 5 years, now over 5 years, and nothing's been done. I'm going to take a look at CWD as a bit of evil, okay? The only way evil can triumph is if good people do nothing at all. Today we do something. We got to have something to start with. We have to have something. The guidelines in that, I appreciate Mike's concern, Mike's opinion, but I don't think this Game and Fish is going to go out there and allow 200 head of deer to be killed, period. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think any state would do that. It'd be foolish because public opinion would be horrible. So I not to be contrary to you, Mike, but I think we have to have a foundation. We have to have something to build on, something to stop this horrible disease. And I think today's the day we can do that. So at least make the effort. Yeah, it might cost us $2 or $3 million and to find out what's going on, what exactly is happening. But I like you, Mike. I want to leave my grandchildren right there.
Mr. President, David, I agree with you. I don't think this department or this commission right here is going to do anything of the sort of going out there and killing 200 mature mule deer bucks on the winter range and the Wyoming range. I don't think they're going to do that. That's not my fear. My fear is some special interest group is going to get that plan, and that's when it's going to happen. It's because we're going to be forced to do something because we said we would. That's what scares me. Mr. President. Greg?
Commissioner Smith, that can't happen. And I'm sorry. If someone is going to stick this plan up our rear end, either on feed ground, as your son-in-law argues, or you argue, or force us to issue 200 permits whack here in the Wyoming range, the plan's already out there. So they have all the information they need to come and say, after a broad and robust public debate, the plan came to the commission, whether we vote aye or nay, it's there. And it's going to be used against us, the way the world works. The only other thing I'd add is, mad cow disease has been on the face of the earth for a long time. Mad cow disease, if you eat an infected cow, you get Crutchfield disease. So there's been, I would hazard, tens of millions, maybe not hundreds of millions of dollars looking at how to solve mad cow disease by the agricultural industry as well as the health industry. Scabies, Mr. Kurtz talks about, it's been around for a long time. People have been researching scabies. The problem, Mike, I have with your position is saying, let our people just figure it out on their own. We have great people. Is absolutely agree with that statement, but we don't have the resources. If Johns Hopkins University, I mean, Hank Edwards is an amazing scientist. Mary Wood was an amazing scientist. We have amazing biologists, but if Johns Hopkins University or whoever's trying to solve Crutchfield disease with hundreds of millions of dollars can't figure out some of these questions with regard to those very similar prion diseases, unfortunately, Wyoming, as good of people as we have, can't figure it out either. The ultimate solution, I believe, is states adopt these plans. We try to work on it. We try to protect the wildlife, and ultimately, there has to be a nationwide program that dedicates tens of millions, and I would suggest probably hundreds of millions of dollars to go do real research on what causes CWD in cervix. I mean, why are elk less likely? Why do we have a lower prevalence than mule deer? Why, do moose seem to have a greater resistance against it? How do you solve it in the environment? That's a nationwide state by state cooperative effort, but it has to start here. It has to start with states saying, here's the problem, here's how we think maybe we'll look at it, and how we might work on it in the future. You have to have a plan. To do nothing is just unacceptable.
And I don't agree with doing nothing. I just have a problem with doing the same thing that's been done. Anybody else?
Yeah, Mr. President. To me, a management plan is a fluid moving law because it's usually a document to guide scientists. And as science learn more, it changes. As it changes, it has to adapt and apply different things. So when I read this plan, I was looking for the cure. Like, what are we going to do to stop it and fix it? And it'll all be done. The more I read about it and learned from Dr. Wood and Payne is nobody has that. So to me, this plan is our plan, and it cracks the door for us to do something. Because I think the public outcry, if we do nothing, will be louder than if we do this plan. When I read the plan, I'm surprised at the hundreds of emails I got about poor shoot deer. I didn't get any comments about water distribution, eliminating hotspots, which are backyard feeders, illegal activities. None of that was ever mentioned. It was just don't shoot deer. And so I want to pass the plan. I want it to be our document that we can, in 6 months, if we want to adapt it or add a chapter or amend it, we can. It's our plan. We can do that. But I think it gives us an opportunity to go out, seek funding, learn more, do some other management strategies, and be the leaders that might be the national leaders that Mike wants us to be. Because I agree, if we just do what's been done, we're just going to get what we've got, and that's 20 years of slow prevalence creep. And so
it's hard to put my mind around because it's gonna take 20 years to get to effect. See if what we did was correct. So we gotta do something. And I would like the door wide open for unlimited opportunities because we gotta start somewhere. So let's jump in with this plan, start. If we don't like the plan, we can amend it. We can take out sections, we can add sections, find the balls, we learn more. So I think it's a starting spot. It's not perfect. It's not what I wanted. But the more I've heard today and the more I've learned about it, it's a lot of work. It was done well. And so to support those people, to support our people and our deer, we better get started because there's no sense waiting another 5 years to do something.
Agreed. You're up, Richard.
President, this is a stroke. The plan says that we're going to learn and adapt over time. We're going to use strategic management that's based on the best available data and science. And to me, that changes on a daily basis when you use the word best, because tomorrow somebody might come up with something better than what we've seen today. And some of them are going to be experimental in nature, but we're trying. I owned a feed store for quite a few years, and Mr. Edwards talked about mineral. I understand talking with some folks and learning yesterday that there has been some tests done with mineral and CWD. But there's a lot of formulations out there, and have they all been tried? There's so much breadth distance in that world that if we could just come up with the right formulation and figure out a way to get it to these animals, maybe it would work. Or, so I guess I'm going to have to say that I would support the plan. We got to do something, and we got to get the door open. We got to let people go to work and try to find an answer to this problem that is really a terrible problem.
I find it interesting that this commission is pretty much a reflection of what you found in your meetings as well. The spectrum of it. It's quite interesting. I think that somebody doesn't think that game and fish commissioners care about wildlife, they haven't been paying attention. I guess I'll throw my 2 cents in. I don't think the plan's perfect. I have problems with it. Justin admitted he's got problems with a few things. But it's not a document that with a closed door on it. It doesn't have a lock on it. It's a start. It's something to try to get going. Maybe none of them work. Maybe none of them work. And we have to find something else and keep working toward another solution. But if it was a solid wall of ideas, then I would not be for it. But anyways.
President, one more comment, please. Earlier we were talking about the wildlife trust. We're literally throwing millions at the wildlife trust, justifiably so. Why aren't we throwing any money on the CWD? I don't mean that's a bad term, throwing money, but we need research. We need to get going on this thing so we can at least find out what the problems are and how we can solve them.
Mr. President, I have a follow-up question, really. And I don't know if it's appropriate for Director Nesbitt or for David, but I want Mike. I hadn't thought about Mike's concern about we signed this document and then the department's held accountable because it says we will implement something and we didn't. Is there are we at risk for that? Is that a viable legal situation we're putting the commissioner department in?
I haven't thought about it, but I'm going to ask David to answer it.
Mr. President, Commissioner, I would just advise you I'm not going to give you that advice in a public meeting. If you want that, I think it'd be appropriate to hold off on your vote. We could discuss it further if you want. Okay. Might even be appropriate to make that discussion. Can we do that tomorrow? Tomorrow morning, executive session?
Well,
I suppose what we could do is we could just table this right now and go to executive session tomorrow morning, then we can reopen, we can bring it back and decide what we're going to do. Is that appropriate?
Well, but David, you're uncomfortable. I think my point is if at some place in the plan it says we will consider this, that someone could bind future commissions to vote in a certain way on, for instance, a season setting recommendation or quota.
Commissioner Frank, that's not my concern. My concern is that I'm going to waive the attorney-client privilege by giving that advice in a public setting, and I don't want to do that.
I understand. I've taken that same position.
Hey, Mr. President, I just want to, and I'm going to go ahead and respect David's position on this. I've got some thoughts, but I think we should wait, have David address this in the executive session. I did want to address some of that Commissioner Ryle brought up, because he does bring up a point that, has been in my mind and my thoughts on this issue for a long time, and that is, so what is that thing that we go do, that big project, that big piece of research? What if we go try to figure out a way to neutralize crayons in the soil? When you really dive into that, and you talk to experts, like our veterinarian, like other veterinarians, like Nick Edwards, I mean, they're like beyond our capacity. And so I'm talking tens of millions of dollars to pull those kind of research projects off. And that's why we haven't gone down that road of asking the commission for money for research projects. We've done some small ones at our research center, but the big ones that really get to those answers, like we're talking about here, are multi-million dollar projects. I will say though, we have testified, provided a lot of input. I personally have with Senator Barrasso's office and the EPW committee. I've testified in front of the Senate and said, look, CWD is a big deal. We need big money to handle this. And they drafted bills and passed them, but they haven't passed both sides yet. And I believe at the end of the day, to fund those big projects, it's something beyond the state of Wyoming's capacity. We really have to rely on Congress to help us.
Mr. President, one option we have is I can make a motion to go to executive session. If you go to executive session, you receive advice from David. And the commissioners asking legal questions that you have with David, and then come back to the public session and have the vote on this. This point, you can finish it up today.
Yeah, that's fine with me.
I would like that. I'd prefer that, because I surely didn't install the process. But
let me
I
just
thought about that.
let me just read something for the group here. One of the first paragraphs. The department will identify select herd units, hunt areas, or subpopulations where appropriate to develop hunting season strategies to reduce or limit CWD prevalence. Now, the definition of will is talking about something with absolute certainty.
But Mike, that doesn't say anything about we're going to whack 200 deers on the issue at license.
No, it doesn't.
That's the point.
But it could.
Well, anything can
It says
happen.
we will.
Right? We will identify herds that have high prevalence. That's our job. But let me do this. I'm going to move that we go to executive session to receive advice on the question that Commissioner Brokaw has asked, which is a legal question.
All right, we have a motion to go to executive session. Second.
Second.
So moved by Commissioner Frank, second by Commissioner Burton, to go into executive session. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? All right.
See that a little bit. How you typing on that?
John Wayne?
Okay. So, Mr. President, if it's appropriate, I would call for the question on the motion.
Okay, question to call?
Sheridan?
Could I ask you to do a roll call vote, please?
Yes. Commissioner Roca,
Aye.
Commissioner Radley,
Aye.
Commissioner Byrd,
Aye.
Commissioner Frank,
Aye.
Commissioner Schmidt,
Nay.
Commissioner Royale.
Aye.
Thank
Okay,
you.
the motion passed. Thank you.
Commission, thank you very much for your review of this plan and approval. Department is dedicated to taking this plan forward to the next steps. Again, thank you on behalf of the working group and all the department personnel that let's let through this. Thank you.
Well, thank you for everyone's work and dedication. We appreciate that. We have one, we're gonna have a call to the public. I have one, who's up here, Jason Ridgway.
So I guess I can speak about anything. So my question is, well, yeah, I guess so. I applied for different states in like Arizona, and they have a tag delegation. Like if I draw a tag for limited quota animals, say let's take a moose for example, why can't I transfer that to my son, immediate youth son they have from 12 to 17? Why can't Wyoming set up something where if I draw a moose tag with my points, my son's 15, I can transfer it to him? I mean, at the end of the day, it's still only one moose getting shot. What's it matter if it's a 40-year-old guy shooting it or my 15-year-old son getting it? Is my question.
Yes.
Yeah, so currently, I mean, it's in Wyoming statute that way, that it's not legal for a person to transfer a license stamp or tag. You know, certainly, you know, you're doing the right thing here, let the commission know what you think. And the other thing to do is when we have talked about any kind of transfer of license in our state, or the idea, and I'll take it a step further, like they do in some Midwestern states, the idea of party hunting.
Right.
It's been fairly soundly rejected by a Wyoming public in the past to allow the transfer of licenses, not only in the scenario you described, to landowners, you know, landowners transferring their licenses, or to allow, you know, large groups to go out and just all hunt on the same licenses. So anyway, that's where it's been in the past. It certainly has been discussed. Your idea has been, and if you're, you know, if you're interested in that, pursuing it, letting the commission know is a great idea. And then the other thing is to talk with your local legislator. That's a good way to start the process from that.
Yeah, and I get the party thing, and I'm not in favor of that, but I mean, I'm just, how Arizona's set up is it has to be immediate, youth 12 to 17 and your immediate son, whether it's adopted or not. Because then the thing gets to, well, people are going to put in, their grandmas are going to put in. Well, that won't work. You have to, and you know, youth only. But it'd be nice to get my kids involved in that. I mean, shit, my kids are going to be 40 before they get to hunt a moose. It puts me at 70. Like, how am I going to enjoy that? Where I have enough, you know, 20 points now. One moose is one moose. So I guess if it's transferred to youth, I don't see, gets them involved more as well.
Yeah, you bring up a very valid point, and a lot of, you know, a point that a lot of folks have been concerned about, when, even especially when this preference point discussion comes up. What do you do with your points? Can you move them around? I mean, if, you know, if somebody passes away, can they will their points to somebody else? And what's, at least to this point, the interpretation of points has been that they're not really a property right, like money, or a piece of real property. But you know, this is one of those things that's been pretty contentious and been pretty hard for anybody to come to agreement on in the past on just how to deal with the issue.
Yeah, I see there's a lot of problems, but it has been discussed then, because I haven't heard anything about that.
It's over the years, it's been discussed several times actually.
Okay, because like I said, I know Arizona has that program and it seems to work pretty well for them. So, all right, thank you guys.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, entertain a motion to adjourn for the day. I move we adjourn. Second. Been moved by Commissioner Crank, second by Commissioner Royale to adjourn. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? We are adjourned. Until tomorrow morning, we will have executive session at 7 a.m. I'll be there.